In the darkness before history, before the imperium, before the stars bore the banners of the emperor, there was a moment, a quiet one, when a soul was forged not in the fires of chance, but by design. He was not born. He was crafted, shaped by the emperor himself, deep beneath the palace on Terra, within the gene vaults where the Primarch project took root. 20 sons of divine science, destined to be generals and gods. But the warp is a jealous sea. Magnus was stolen. Before his first cry echoed in Terra's halls, he vanished. Like his brothers, he was cast adrift by the capricious tides of the Imperium, some cruel twist of fate, or the dark will of powers who already feared what he might become. The Emperor searched, but the warp does not yield easily. When Magnus opened his eyes, it was not Terra he saw. It was Prospero, a world of red sands and broken beauty. Dust storms howled across endless deserts, and beneath the scorched skies, tribes of outcast psychers struggled to survive. Prospero was not a kind place, but it was a place of minds. Here, psychic gifts were not burned at the stake or bound in iron. Here, the mind was sacred. And so when Magnus arrived, he was not feared, he was revered. From the moment he stepped upon Prospero's surface, he was not like the others. He was tall, giant even as a child, with crimson skin that shimmered in the twin suns, and a single, luminous eye in the center of his brow. That eye was no deformity. It was the window to a soul older than the planet beneath his feet, a soul that remembered things it should not. Magnus walked the dusty roads of Prospero as a child, but he learned like a god. Books crumbled under his gaze, truths unfolded before him. He did not need to be taught, he remembered. With frightening ease, he spoke languages no man had recorded. He debated the principles of the warp with elder scholars who had studied them for lifetimes. Some said he was the reincarnation of a forgotten god. Others whispered he was the end of all knowledge made flesh. They called him sorcerer, seer, king. He united the fractured conclaves of Prospero's psychic elite, the cults of the enlightened, and bound them under one vision. Tisca, the city of light, rose beneath his will. Ivory spires kissed the sky, pyramids of thought and power stacked upon the shores of endless knowledge. Under Magnus, the city became a beacon, not just for Prospero, but for the galaxy beyond. Scholars, dreamers, psychers in hiding, all found their way to his gates. And in the heart of the great library, beneath wards etched in truths and madness, Magnus began his work. He did not simply study the warp, he sought to master it, not out of hubris, not yet, but from belief. He had seen what psychers could become if left afraid of their gifts. He had seen what fear did to knowledge. The warp, he believed, could be understood, harnessed, made safe. He was wrong. Even then, even as he bent the tides of unreality to his will, things watched. The warp does not give freely. It only waits. Every step into the great ocean was a step into the jaws of something deeper. And yet Magnus pressed on, driven by curiosity, by a hunger to pierce the veil that even the Emperor had drawn. The warp held answers. It had to. Why else would it whisper in dreams? And the dreams came. They were not nightmares, not yet, but visions, memories. He saw the face of the Emperor, golden and terrible, reaching across the stars. He saw a throne not yet built and a galaxy aflame. In his mind, he touched the minds of others like him, others who did not yet know their names. Alfarius, Mortarion, Angron. He saw them all. Brothers scattered like embers. He wept when he dreamed of them. When Magnus looked into the warp, he did not just see the future. He saw his past. He knew he was not meant for Prospero. The world had taken him in, yes, but it was not his birthright. He was born to lead, born to command. His blood was not of man. It was something higher. He felt it in every strand of his being, power waiting to be called, a purpose unfulfilled. And still he waited. The Emperor did not come. Decades passed, Tisca bloomed, and Magnus reigned not as a tyrant but as a teacher. His students adored him. His city became legend. But always he looked to the stars. He knew the day would come. He had seen it over and over in his mind. The day when fire would streak across the sky and his father would descend in gold. The day when truth would be spoken at last. And the warp began to twist. The visions grew darker. Whispers became voices. They spoke not in fear but in flattery. They offered knowledge, secrets even Magnus had not uncovered. Some he refused, others he accepted. For what harm is there in knowing? What sin is there in understanding? The warp had an answer, and so the red-skinned king of a lost world, forged in a moment the universe tried to forget, stood at the edge of his own story, the last of the great sorcerer kings. A mind unmatched, a soul wounded by truths it should not hold, and somewhere deep beneath terror, the Emperor still searched, still waited, still believed his son could be saved. But fate had already taken root, and fate, like Magnus, has only one eye, and sees everything. They say Tisca rose not from stone, but from thought, a city built first in the mind of a god, and only afterward shaped by the hands of men. On Prospero, where the dunes swallowed cities and storms erased legacies in hours, Tisca endured. No wind touched it, no flame scorched it, no shadow dared crawl across its flawless ivory walls. It stood alone, defiant in its brilliance, a jewel buried in an ocean of red dust. This was the dream made real by Magnus the Red. But the city was not merely his throne, it was his reflection. From the high peaks of the Agoru Ranges to the shores of Lake Viridis, pilgrims wandered across the wastes, seeking the shining city. Outcasts, psychics, witches, visionaries, those cast out by fearful worlds, found sanctuary here, and Tisca accepted them all. There were no burning pyres here, no collars of sigh-dampening steel. The soul was not feared, it was studied, honored. Every tower in Tisca housed a school, every plaza echoed with debate. The pyramid of Fodep taught memory manipulation. The obsidian vault preserved relics of psychic phenomena too dangerous to name. Beneath the vault, Magnus himself conducted forbidden experiments in private, explorations into soul division, mind-binding, and dreams that bled into reality. Prospero's surface was calm, serene, but beneath it, sorcery pulsed like a second heart, and the people loved him for it. Magnus did not rule with iron or doctrine. His word was law, yes, but it was rarely needed. He walked among his scholars as one of them, listened to street philosophers, corrected apprentices with a gentle hand, and rewarded brilliance with access to higher truths. To live in Tisca was to live beneath the wing of a god who hungered for enlightenment. That hunger became a contagion. Children debated warp theory before they could read. Artists painted using emotion instead of pigment. Librarians trained in both language and mind dueling. It was a golden age, but all golden things carry the weight of a coming fall. Beneath the polished streets of Tisca lay remnants of earlier cities. Ruins, old stone chambers half swallowed by sand. The Prosperine claimed they were built by the first psychers to survive the burning days, an ancient time when Prospero's skies boiled, and those with the gift died by the thousands, torn apart by powers they could not control. That age had ended. Magnus had seen to it, but the echoes remained. They whispered in dreams, in mirrors, in the blood-slicked walls of the vault. Tisca listened, and sometimes it answered. Within this web of wisdom and quiet madness, Magnus built his legion. Before the Emperor's return, before the black-armored Thunderhawks filled the sky, Magnus had already begun preparing. He did not know the shape they would take, only that they would come. Soldiers, scholars, warriors born of his blood. The dreams spoke of them. He saw hands wreathed in flame, eyes glowing with knowledge no mortal could bear. In visions, they marched through cities not yet built, bearing the sigil of the thousand-fold eye. Some called them angels, others monsters. And then the Thunderhawks came. They landed not as conquerors, but as kin. Clad in crimson and gold, they descended upon Tisca and knelt before their father. These were the remnants of the 15th Legion, dying, cursed, and few. Barely 1,000 remained, ravaged by mutation, racked by the flesh change. It was a curse Magnus had foreseen long before he knew its name. They bore his blood, but that blood boiled inside them. Some grew extra limbs, others wept molten tears. Many died screaming, their minds dissolving into pools of uncontrolled thought. It was the gene curse, and it was consuming them. Magnus did not flinch. He welcomed them. In the Hall of Echoes beneath the central pyramid, he laid their broken forms upon the stone and spoke words no other could hear. He did not scream to the warp. He whispered, and the warp whispered back. The flesh change stopped. Some say it was sorcery. Others believe he cut a deal in the dark, that he traded his eye for their lives. Whatever the truth, Magnus emerged from the ritual changed. His cyclopean gaze now glowed with unnatural clarity. His sons, once doomed, rose strong, whole, reborn. Tisca rejoiced. Now they marched through the plazas, these golden demigods. They studied with the scholars, debated alongside civilians. They weren't just warriors, they were savants. Each space marine bore a psychic gift, and each was encouraged to develop it. In no other legion did such power exist. In no other city could it be refined. Tisca had become not just a sanctuary, it had become a crucible. The people called them the 1,000 Sons. Their numbers grew. Magnus hand-selected his officers, Arsek Ahrimain, his chief librarian, Hathor Mat the chronomancer, Phocis Takar, master of flame. Each bore a symbol of their power etched into their pauldrons, and each ascended through the cults, 9 paths of mastery, 9 disciplines of sorcery, named for the secret stars they once aligned with. From the pyramids, lightning split the sky in patterns that carried meaning. Warp storms bent away from Prospero, fearful of what they might awaken. And Tisca became legend. There were those beyond Prospero who began to notice. Other worlds sent envoys. Some returned with tomes of enlightenment. Others were never heard from again. Rumors spread of cities built from thought, of men who spoke with the voices of the dead. The Mechanicum whispered that Tisca housed weapons not of steel, but of belief. The Inquisition's precursors marked the city as a danger, even as they lacked the strength to challenge it. But in the heart of it all, Magnus remained serene. He did not see danger in what he built. He saw progress, enlightenment. He believed truly that his city and his sons could become a beacon for all mankind, a prototype for what humanity could be, not chained by fear but liberated by will, not restrained by faith but driven by truth. And still the warp stirred. It never stopped watching, never stopped whispering. Even as Magnus stood on his highest balcony and looked out across his shining city, he felt it. A presence, amused, patient, waiting. But he did not yet understand. He only saw the city, the light, the towers that pierced the sky like questions hurled at the stars. Tisca was eternal. Tisca was perfection, and nothing perfect ever lasts. They called it aspirant's madness at first, a whispered affliction, unspoken between legionaries, save in bitter half-jests or solemn warnings from veterans to recruits. Muscles spasmed where they should not. Bones grew where no bones belonged. The mind fractured and then the flesh followed. Jaws dislocated into screaming maws, fingers split into claws, some collapsed into shrieking beasts, their armor bursting like fruit skin torn by something primal clawing to escape. It began as a whisper, it ended as a curse. The Legion, those who would come to be known as the Thousand Sons, suffered alone, cloaked in shame. It was not a flaw in discipline or training, it was inside them. Buried deep within their gene seed, coiled like a serpent waiting for the moment to strike. No physician of Mars could explain it, no apothecary could halt it. The Mechanicum offered cold diagnostics. The Legion turned inward, entire companies disappeared overnight. Gone not in battle, but in silence, quarantined, purged, or worse. Dossiers were sealed, names were struck from memory. On the few occasions when the legions fought side by side during the early Great Crusade, others began to notice. The 15th Legion was thinning. Fast. The edict from Terra was unspoken but understood. Keep them distant, use them sparingly, and pray the rot doesn't spread. By the time the Emperor's fleets reached Prospero, by the time Magnus returned to his sons, less than 1,000 of the Thousand Sons remained. He arrived in silence. The reunion was not celebratory, it was mournful. The Gene Sons met their father in the Hall of Becoming, on a lonely basalt plateau far from the gleaming towers of Tisca. They had dreamed of this day, though many had stopped believing it would ever come. The Crimson King stood before them, a giant in gold and crimson robes, his cyclopean eye glowing with a sorrow they did not yet understand. They were warriors. They had fought on hundreds of worlds, wielding flame and force of will. They had broken xeno-empires and annihilated rebellious human warlords. But they were dying. And Magnus could see it instantly, not in the armor or the scars, but in the aura that clung to them. Unstable, warping, desperate. He did not speak at first. He only watched them kneel. Then he wept. No one saw the tears, but Ahriman would later write of it in his private codices, how the Crimson King's fists clenched behind his back, how the air around him shimmered, how silence deepened into grief. "I see you," he finally said, "and I see what has been done to you." The gene seed was flawed. Magnus knew this instinctively. He did not need a data slate or a sample. It was written in the way their psychic fields stuttered, in the lingering warp resonance around their forms. Something had poisoned the lineage, something ancient, or something deliberate. The flesh change, as it was now named, was not a mere mutation. It was punishment, a retribution hidden in blood, and Magnus would not abide it. He retreated into isolation. Beneath the Temple of Wounds, deep below the foundations of Tisca, there was a chamber known as the Thought Crypt, a place where sound was devoured and time unraveled. It was here Magnus pored over everything, ancient forbidden texts, warp charts from lost civilizations, fragments of the Emperor's earliest genetic manuscripts. He meditated in darkness for weeks without end, his mind unraveling into strands of pure thought, his body remaining as still as stone, and then he reached out into the warp. This was no idle scrying, no mere divination or star-laced augury. Magnus entered the sea between realities, not as a voyager but as a diver plunging into unknown depths. His soul cut through the tides of madness. He passed by shrieking spirits, demons with eyes like planets, thought creatures that hungered for names. He whispered oaths in languages never meant for mortal tongues. And something answered. What Magnus offered. No one truly knows. Some say it was his eye, the one gifted by the Emperor. Others whisper it was a piece of his soul, the part still tethered to Terra. What is known is this: he emerged changed, pale, quieter. His cyclopean eye glowed with unnatural certainty, and the flesh change stopped, completely. The Thousand Sons awoke from nightmares to find their minds clear, their bodies stable. The mutation that had haunted them for decades was gone, as if it had never been. But the legionaries whispered of dreams in the days that followed, dreams of a golden tower in the middle of a starless void, of a throne made from mirrors, and a voice that had no mouth. They felt watched, and they felt indebted. Magnus told them nothing. He gathered his sons. They knelt once more before him, not as broken warriors, but as reborn sons. This time he did not weep. He smiled. With a voice like thunder cloaked in silk, he named them truly, the Thousand Sons, not for their number, but for their survival. For they had walked through death and returned. No legion was so few, no legion so potent. And then the rebuilding began. Magnus did not appeal to Terra. He did not beg for reinforcements from the Emperor's gene labs. Instead, he oversaw the integration of his legion with the arcane cults of Prospero. Scholars became serfs, serfs became scribes, scribes became neophytes. The legion trained not just in war, but in philosophy, psychology, and the manipulation of raw warp energy. Every initiate was tested, not for strength of arm, but strength of will. The Thousand Sons would not fall again. Magnus watched them grow. He walked among them, not as a distant Primarch, but as a mentor, a father. He knew them by name. He corrected their incantations. He encouraged their experimentation. He urged them to never fear the warp, but to command it. But behind his eye, something smoldered, a quiet fury. At the Emperor for allowing the flaw to exist, at the Imperium for leaving the 15th Legion to rot, at the Warp for demanding a price, and at himself for paying it. The flesh change was gone, but in its place something else had taken root. Something worse. No one noticed then. Not Ahriman, not the librarians, not even Magnus himself. But in the deepest vaults of the Thought Crypt, where Magnus had made his pact, a mark was left, a ripple in the fabric of causality, the crimson seal of a god who did not forget. The Cyclops had sacrificed to save his sons, and in doing so, had opened a door, one that would never close again. The galaxy was fire and promise, and the Emperor's banners stretched like constellations from one bleeding star system to the next. Worlds fell to compliance beneath the tread of giants, and among those giants now marched the Thousand Sons, reborn, reshaped, and utterly devoted. They were not the largest legion, nor the most ferocious, but they were something rarer, precise, purposeful. Each warrior was a blade of the mind and the soul, not just the body. Where other legions brought war like a hammer strike, the Thousand Sons were a scalpel, slicing into the hearts of rebellions, dissecting Xeno's empires, unraveling enemies not with bloodshed, but with insight. And at their head, Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. The galaxy had never seen a force like him. Where the other Primarchs roared across battlefields, Magnus walked in silence, eyes glowing with truths not yet written. While Guilliman drafted logistics and Horus plotted military doctrine, Magnus stared into the screaming horizon of the warp and carved order from madness. His presence on a battlefield changed the shape of the war before the first shot was ever fired. It began with the Ulis sector, a war zone dominated by fragmented Xenos factions and rogue human warlords. Where the Luna Wolves had failed to pacify the uprisings, the Thousand Sons were deployed, initially as advisors, then as executors. No great campaign of conquest was needed. In a matter of weeks, the sector was pacified. Entire armies laid down their arms after mere dreams of surrender. Rebel leaders turned themselves in, plagued by nightmares tailored precisely to their guilt. The Imperium called it genius. The Mechanicum called it witchcraft. Ahriman called it justice. From Ulisor to Bellica IV, the pattern repeated. The 15th Legion descended not with fire, but with calculation. Before their boots even touched soil, Magnus would enter meditation, his psychic reach casting itself like a net across the system. He would know his enemy, what they feared, what they craved, what thread could be pulled to unravel them. And then he would pass that vision to his sons. Each 1,000 son was more than a soldier. They were analysts, scholars, scribes of fate. Their armor gleamed crimson and gold, etched with symbols older than the Imperium itself. Sigils drawn not for aesthetic, but for psychic resonance. To see a phalanx of the 15th Legion take formation was to witness ritual-made war. Their formations were fluid, shifting with mental commands rather than vox signals. Their bolters did not simply fire, they guided their rounds with instinctive bursts of telekinetic force. Their flamers summoned not promethium, but searing ethereal flame, psychic constructs that burned the soul as much as the flesh. On Carapax, they faced the mind oracles of Kurlon, a Xenos empire of telepaths who had dominated dozens of worlds through sheer mental supremacy. The Imperium had lost 5 regiments trying to breach their labyrinthine cities, where every wall whispered madness and every shadow was a trap. Magnus studied the city for a day. Then he walked through its gates alone. By sundown, the oracles were dead. None witnessed what occurred. But when the 1,000 sons entered after him, they found the city silent. Every Xenos lay still, eyes glazed over, blood crystallized into symbols none could decipher. Magnus offered no explanation. He only said, "Thought cannot defeat thought that knows its own death." There was awe among the legions, and suspicion. Leman Russ scowled when Magnus spoke. Mortarion refused to walk within the same chamber. Even Rogel Dorn, stalwart and rational, watched the 1,000 sons as one watches a sleeping serpent, admiring the form, dreading the moment it wakes. But the Emperor? He smiled, for now they were needed. The Great Crusade surged on, and with it the 1,000 sons grew in number and renown. Their librarius was unlike any other, a true order of warp masters. 9 cults had formed, each devoted to a discipline of psychic warfare. The cult of Pyre wielded fire, the Athenaeum mastered telepathy, the Corvidae read the future in the paths of falling ash. Each battle refined their arts, each victory further justified their creed. But behind that glory was unease. Some among them began to push too far. In their hunger to unravel the fabric of the warp, experiments emerged, thought beasts crafted from stolen emotions, psychic parasites that burrowed into enemy command networks, dream constructs used to torment Xenos leaders into madness. What had begun as surgical precision began to stray into occult manipulation. And Magnus, he allowed it. Perhaps because he saw where the Imperium was heading. Or because he still believed that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, was not to be feared. He taught that the warp could be understood, controlled. It was not evil, merely misunderstood. A mirror reflecting the soul of its wielder. But the mirror began to crack. Whispers grew, not just among the Astartes, but among the humans they served. Soldiers who fought beside the 15th Legion reported strange dreams, visions of Prospero, of towers of glass filled with screaming light. Entire regiments posted near 1,000 Suns, detachments went mad. There were reports of warriors not dying when they should have, of wounds sealing without medics, of thoughts being read mid-battle. The Administratum filed incident reports. The Mechanicum logged anomalies. Some whispered the word sorcery, and in the halls of the Sigillite's inner sanctum, the name Magnus was spoken with caution. Still, compliance after compliance was achieved. Dozens of worlds swore fealty to Terra beneath the crimson banners of the Thousand Suns. Magnus wrote treatises on psychic warfare that would become secret scripture among future librarians. And on Prospero, the newly expanded legion returned between campaigns to meditate, to study, to refine. Tisca became more than a city. It became a university of gods. But something stirred beneath the marble floors. Something subtle. During a campaign on Nicaea, a distant shrine world, they recovered a relic, a crystalline tome not built by human hands. It whispered when opened. It wept when closed. Ahriman claimed it was merely an artifact of a pre-Old Night civilization, but it knew Magnus's name. And when Magnus touched it, it knew his true name. He told no one. He locked it in the vault. But at night he could feel it breathing. The great crusade marched on. The Thousand Suns followed, minds sharp, souls sharpened further. But behind every battle won, every campaign closed, was the sound of turning pages and the scent of burning dust. The Thousand Suns were no longer just servants of the Emperor. They were something else, something becoming. And far away in the warp's deepest currents, something watched and smiled. The stars above Nicaea shone like a judgmental host, cold, unmoved, and vast. They stared down upon a world of silent temples and ivory amphitheaters, as if they too waited for a verdict long overdue. This was no battlefield. There were no trenches, no howls of war machines, no banners of conquest. Yet, for the Thousand Suns, it would be remembered as the place where their dreams were broken, not by bolter fire or blade, but by decree. The edict would be forged not in war, but in words. The summons came in coded astropathic cant, an invitation sent across the Imperium to all legions and many arms of imperial governance. Not a command, but something deeper. A summons from the Emperor himself. The destination, the shrine world of Nicaea, long held sacred for its monastic serenity and psychic resonance. A planet of pillars and echoing stone, of wind-blasted plateaus and endless white-domed courts. A world chosen not for its grandeur, but for the symbolic purity it represented. The purpose, to settle the question of sorcery once and for all. Too many incidents, too many unexplainable horrors, entire worlds destabilized by uncontrolled psychic phenomena. Warp-born aberrations tearing through the veil, civilian populations crippled by mind plagues, astropaths muttering warnings with their last breath. And at the heart of it all, at least in the minds of many, was the Thousand Suns. They had become too powerful, too strange, too uncomfortable to those who did not understand them. Magnus arrived in silence. No pageantry, no escorts, just the Crimson King and a small retinue of his most senior officers, Ahriman among them, descending in an obsidian-skinned thunderhawk that left no trace upon the landing platform. He did not wear a crown, though he walked like a king. He did not carry a weapon, though all present felt its weight in his gaze. He knew what this was, a trial. The Council of Nicaea convened in the Spiral Forum, a vast stone arena with tiered balconies that circled a central speaking floor. On those balconies sat the voices of the Imperium, Primarchs, Lord Commanders, Navigators, Administratum officials, even Sisters of Silence and Custodians. Their robes bore sigils of rank, their eyes watched like eagles, and their tongues were honed for politics. At the highest seat sat the Emperor, radiant and motionless, his aura dimmed yet ever present. He did not speak. He did not need to. His will, as always, was absolute. Each Primarch was called to speak in turn. Leman Russ was first, and his voice thundered like a Fenrisian avalanche. To him, sorcery was not a tool. It was a cancer, a threat not just to the Imperium's stability, but to its soul. He recounted the horrors he had seen, psychers consumed by their own powers, battlefields warped into demon-haunted nightmares. "We are warriors," he growled, "not witches." Mortarion followed, colder and more calculating. His hatred of psychers came not from ignorance, but from the scars of a childhood ruled by warp-spawned tyrants. "Power should not be its own justification," he said. "The warp whispers to all who listen, and those who listen too long become its slaves." Even Rogel Dorn, ever the stoic bulwark of imperial law, voiced concern, not hatred but caution. "We cannot build an imperium upon unshackled flame," he warned. "It will burn through the foundations before the walls are even raised." But not all voices condemned. Jagatai Khan, ever the unpredictable wind, shrugged off the paranoia. "Fear is not wisdom," he said, with the easy arrogance of one who rarely cared for imperial politics. "What matters is discipline, not fear of the flame, but command of it." Sanguinius spoke next, angelic, mournful, measured. "The warp is a mirror," he said, "and it shows us our own darkness. But a mirror is not to blame for the face it reflects." And then came Magnus. He stepped alone into the speaking circle, not cloaked in arcane symbols, not accompanied by demonic whispers. Just a man, if such a being could be called a man, with a voice that carried not in volume, but in clarity. "I was made this way," he began, "by our Father." He did not preach, he did not bluster, he taught. He spoke of psychic potential as the next step in mankind's evolution. He outlined the metaphysics of the warp, its currents and tempests, its dangers and its gifts. He presented the librarius programs across the legions as evidence that psychers could serve responsibly. He reminded them that the Emperor himself was the greatest psycher of all. "We must not fear what we are," he said, his single eye scanning the room. "To shun the warp is to shun truth, and the truth does not go away because we refuse to name it." There was no applause, only silence. Ahriman would later say he had never seen his gene father so exposed. Magnus had laid bare his soul before an audience trained to distrust it. But truth alone does not always win hearts. And so the Emperor stood, all eyes turned, no word spoken, but all felt the change, like the air had thickened into oil. And then he spoke, softly, powerfully, without rancor, without rage, but with finality. The warp, he said, was not to be trifled with. Mankind stood upon the precipice of destruction every time it reached into that unseen realm. The Psyker's gift, though real, was a curse more often than a blessing. The Imperium would not risk its future on uncontrolled power. From that day forward, all use of sorcery was banned. The librarius divisions were to be disbanded. All psychic activity would be strictly regulated by sanctioned institutions under imperial oversight. The ruling was clear. But it was more than a ruling. It was a condemnation. Magnus bowed his head. His face betrayed nothing, but inside something cracked. He had obeyed. He had served. He had warned them of the dangers. He had offered guidance. And now the door was slammed in his face, not just on him, but on his entire legion. They had built themselves in the light of truth, only to be cast into shadow. He returned to Prospero not as a vindicated scholar, but as a man exiled in all but name. The 1,000 sons received the news in silence. A few raged, a few wept, but most, like their Primarch, simply withdrew. They packed away their tomes, they sealed their vaults, they extinguished the flames in their ritual halls, but they did not forget. Magnus returned to his private sanctum beneath the pyramid of Photep. There, alone among the stars and the endless shelves of hidden knowledge, he opened a new codex, a book unwritten, a tome that would not bear the seal of Terra or the mark of the Aquila. He wrote in silence with a pen of crystal and ink that shimmered like the void. He called it the Book of Magnus, and within its pages he swore this vow: the Imperium fears what it does not understand. But I will understand everything. And somewhere far beyond the veil something stirred, something that listened, something that waited. The warp is not fire, it is not water, it is not air or earth or any of the things that humans wrap their fragile understanding around. It is intention, it is thought, magnified until it burns. It is desire so sharp it draws blood from the stars. And when Magnus the Red reached into it once more, after Nicaea, after the Emperor's edict, after he was told no, he did so not out of rebellion. He did it out of love. The vision came to him as dreams too vivid to be dreams. At first, broken whispers at the edge of meditation, then a flood of images drenched in fire and blood, a battle at the edge of the eye, legions turning against legions, golden warriors crushed beneath blackened armor. The face of Horus, warped and terrible, screaming into the warp as he tore through brother and kin. And at the end of it all, the throne, dark, shattered, empty. Magnus saw the Imperium's future, and he wept. He tried to warn them. He tried to tell Ahriman, the librarians, the Council of Tisca, but their faces were too much like masks, cold, hollow. Nicaea had broken something in all of them, not just pride, but faith. They no longer believed the Imperium wanted saving. Magnus alone bore the weight of what was to come, and in his loneliness he chose to act, to break the law of his father, not carelessly, not in pride, but in desperation. The warp could carry messages faster than any astropath, any data packet or engine of the Mechanicum. It could cross systems in the space between thoughts. It could speak truth from one mind to another without a single breath drawn. So Magnus built a ritual. He stood at the summit of the Pyramid of Photep, surrounded by his inner circle, Ahriman, Kalophis, Balek Uthizar, Phocis Takar, the most potent psychers in the Thousand Suns, all willing to risk their minds for the vision of their Primarch. They etched runes into the stone with words, not blades. They wove circles of mirrored silver to catch the reflection of what was to come. Candles were lit with flame drawn from Magnus's soul. They would not contact Terra by machine. They would enter it, astrally, psychically, utterly. They called it the Mirror Path. And when it opened, it screamed. From the apex of Prospero, Magnus's soul left his body. He soared into the immaterium like a spear thrown by purpose. The warp folded around him, recognizing a familiar sun. It made way like a tide drawing back. But nothing moves cleanly in the warp. As he crossed that impossibility between stars, he left wounds behind him, burning tears in real space that spat nightmares into the void. Imperial navigators would later report entire fleets swallowed by sudden storms. Civilian worlds fell into panic as their astropaths clawed out their own eyes, whispering, "The one-eyed god walks." But Magnus did not see this. He saw only terror. And then he pierced it. The Emperor's palace was layered in wards, locked behind psychic gates, wrapped in layers of secrecy and silence that no mortal mind could imagine. But Magnus was not mortal. He had been forged in the same vaults that birthed those walls. He knew them. Like a key knows the shape of a lock. With a thought, he shattered them, and something else shattered with them. Deep beneath the palace, the Emperor had labored in secret for decades, not to build a weapon, but a hope, the webway. A vast network of psychic roads meant to bypass the warp entirely, a future in which mankind no longer relied on the great ocean, no longer risked corruption or madness just to travel the stars, a future safe from demons. Magnus didn't know, Not truly. He only knew that he had to reach the Emperor. He burst into the inner sanctum like a star collapsing inward. 1,000 wards died in that instant. The psychic fabric of the webway tore like parchment, and the demons came screaming through. He had opened a hole inside the imperial palace. The golden throne flared with light. The Emperor, seated upon it, raised his hand, not in greeting, but in command. He hurled Magnus from his presence like a father disowning a son. The psychic backlash struck Magnus like a meteor. His astral form reeled, collapsing back through the warp, shattering through its layers, returning to Prospero with the force of a dying sun. He awoke surrounded by silence. The ritual chamber was cracked and scorched. Some of his inner circle bled from their eyes. Others had stopped breathing. Ahriman knelt, shaking, whispering the names of long-dead brothers. Magnus said nothing. For 3 days he vanished into his inner sanctum. No food, no voice, no light. When he emerged, he wore his armor not as a prince, but as a penitent. His skin seemed dimmer, his eye darker. He had tried to save the Imperium, and he had broken it. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that his message to the Emperor had been too late. Horus's betrayal was already underway. But worse, his breach of terror had shattered the Emperor's greatest secret. The webway was now compromised. The Golden Throne, meant to power humanity's salvation, had to be transformed into a seal, a plug. The Emperor would never leave it again, and Magnus had sealed his fate. But the punishment was yet to come. Far across the void, Leman Russ received new orders. Not from the Emperor, but from a corrupted channel, manipulated by Horus. The message was simple: Prospero burns. And on Prospero, Magnus waited. He had seen it in a vision, days before. The wolves were coming. He could flee. He could rally his sons. He could prepare the greatest defenses the galaxy had ever seen. But he did nothing. He looked to the stars and saw no light. He stood at the center of his great library, surrounded by a lifetime of knowledge, and whispered, "So be it." He had defied his father. He had broken the world. And now fire would come. It began not with war cries or horns of battle, but with silence. A silence so profound it seemed to choke the stars above Prospero. For days, the skies had been wrong, clouds shifting in unnatural geometries, the wind whispering names no tongue could speak, and the dreams of Tiska's people turning to ash before the first shot was fired. Magnus knew what approached. He had seen it, not in the cold calculations of logic or the studied analysis of a strategist, but in the raw and merciless clarity of a seer. He had watched it unfold across 1,000 future threads, burning spires, shattered minds, sons dying with names half-formed on their lips. And still, he had done nothing. He ordered no defenses raised, no ships were scrambled. The planetary defense grid remained idle. The great warp barriers that could have shielded the city remained unlit. Instead, he locked himself in his sanctum deep beneath the Great Pyramid, and waited, not with hope, not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted inevitability, as though he were watching the final act of a play he'd once written and long since forgotten. When the wolves came, they did so without pretense. The skies split with fire as the fleet of the 6th Legion entered orbit. No challenge, no declaration, no honor-bound duel, just death, delivered from the void in precise and unrelenting fury. Orbital bombardment rained down across Prospero's surface, reducing its outskirts to vitrified glass within hours. Towering observatories were flattened. Temples, centuries in the building, evaporated into dust. Civilian sectors vanished in flashes of atomic light, their cries lost in the thunder. But Tiska stood. Protected by the psychic might of its remaining 1,000 sons, the City of Light refused to die quietly. The The surviving librarians, warriors, and scholars, the last flame of Prospero, gathered beneath the spires and pyramids to face the apocalypse. Some still begged for orders, others prayed to the emperor, or to Magnus, or to the truth, but most simply stood ready. Warriors born of the mind, trained in the arts of the soul, braced for a battle that no logic said they could win. And then the wolves made planetfall. Legions of gray-armored monsters descended like a winter storm from the void. Space wolves, the Emperor's executioners, the hunter kings of Fenris. They came with blades blessed in the name of blood, fangs bared, and hatred boiling beneath their oaths. They had been told that Prospero was lost, that Magnus was a traitor, that the Thousand Sons had consorted with demons, broken the Emperor's laws, and defiled the very fabric of reality. They believed this. They had to, because otherwise what they did would be murder. What followed was not war, it was annihilation. The first lines clashed in the Plaza of Glass, where towering statues of ancient scholars stood watch. Within minutes, those statues were rubble, and the ground was slick with blood and warp fire. Thousand Sons fought not like other legions. They wielded more than bolters. Their minds became weapons. Streams of telekinetic force hurled wolves into the air like rag dolls. Fire leapt from their palms, lightning cracked from their eyes. Reality itself twisted around them, shaped by centuries of psychic mastery. But the wolves did not falter. They fought with the fury of Fenris itself, every warrior a living weapon. Nullfield generators and Sisters of Silence stalked behind their ranks, silencing the warp, choking the breath from every spell. For every sorcerer who unleashed a storm, there was a pack of hunters already lunging through it, blades in hand. They closed the gap with terrifying speed, ripping through the Thousand Sons before incantations could be completed. The fighting tore through Tisca like wildfire. In the Ether Archives, librarian Calophus was impaled defending forbidden texts, his last breath spent hurling them into the warp to preserve them from destruction. The vaults of Eternum collapsed in on themselves, scorched by plasma strikes and sorcerous backlashes. In the Gallery of Sight, Phocis Takar stood alone, wreathed in flame, his final stand immolating hundreds, only for the wolves to charge through the inferno and butcher him without pause. Civilians, scholars, scribes, even children were cut down alongside warriors. There were no lines drawn, no terms offered. The wolves had not come for justice. They had come for an ending. And above it all, Magnus watched. From his throne within the central pyramid, he felt every death as if it were his own. His eye wept blood, his heart cracked with every cry that reached his mind. But he did not act. He did not rise. Even as Ahriman and the remaining captains begged him to intervene, to strike back, to do something, he refused. "I have already done enough," he said. "Let them finish what I began." But even sorrow has its limits. When the pyramid itself began to quake and the walls of his sanctum split, Magnus finally rose. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with something colder, something ancient. Resolve. He descended into the chaos like a crimson god, the air around him warping with each step. His presence silenced battle for a heartbeat. Thousand Sons and space wolves alike turned, instinctually drawn to the terrible majesty of the Cyclops. And then he roared. Reality tore, the skies split with fire. Magnus unleashed the full might of his being, not as a general, but as a force of nature. Wolves were vaporized mid-charge, bolters exploded in the hands of those who dared raise them. He walked through fire, untouched, wielding power beyond comprehension, and then Leman Russ came for him. The Wolf King, Primarch of the Sixth, charged through the flames, his blade Mjolnir raised high, his armor scarred by lightning. The two brothers met in a storm of raw power. Magnus, tall as a titan, eyes burning with betrayal. Russ, snarling with righteous fury, determined to end what he saw as heresy incarnate. They did not speak. They simply fought. Each blow shattered the air. Magnus wielded sorcery that bent time, summoned echoes of himself, collapsed probabilities. Russ countered with speed that defied logic, instinct honed by lifetimes of war, and the nulling weight of the sisters behind him. It was not just a duel, it was a judgment passed between gods. And at the end, Russ broke him. With a final roar, Leman Russ drove his blade into Magnus's chest, and with a heaving cry lifted him and snapped his spine across his knee. The sound echoed through the ruins of Tizca like the death knell of a civilization. The Crimson King fell, but the warp is never silent. With his body broken, Magnus called out, not with his voice but with his soul, and something answered. A scream not of pain, but of transcendence. Warp light flared, and in a blinding pulse of unreality, Magnus vanished. Alongside him, dozens of his surviving sons disappeared as well, torn from the battlefield into the imperium itself. The wolves stood amidst the ashes, their prey escaped. But the city was dead. Tizca burned. Its towers collapsed, its libraries turned to cinders, its people erased, and with it the soul of Prospero was extinguished, not with glory, not with triumph, but with silence, a silence that would echo for 10,000 years, and in that silence the 1,000 sons would remember. They would never forget. There are moments in history where time does not pass, it fractures. When the weight of an event becomes so immense, so reality-breaking, that the chronicle of everything before it no longer matters. Prospero's burning was one such moment, not merely the destruction of a city, not just a battle between brothers. It was a wound in the timeline of mankind, and its echoes would never fade. But Prospero's death was not the end of the 1,000 sons. It was their metamorphosis. When Magnus vanished from the battlefield in that blinding eruption of warp light, the space wolves believed him dead or banished to some fragment of unreality, broken and beaten. The truth was stranger and far more terrible. Magnus had not died. He had ascended, not in glory, not by choice, but by the hand of something that had been watching him since the day he first touched the warp. The changer of ways, the architect of fate, Tzeentch. In the shattered moment between his spine breaking and his spirit rupturing, Magnus called out, not in words but in raw psychic despair, a call that was heard not by Terra, not by his father, but by the throne beneath the throne, by the power that had whispered to him in dreams, the same power he had thought to master. Tzeentch answered. A rift opened in the fabric of space, not above Prospero, but within it. The last remaining threads of the 1,000 Sons' psychic presence were yanked from real space like moths into flame. Dozens of survivors vanished in an instant. Ahriman, Hathor-Mat, Uthizar, and those sorcerers who had not yet fallen in the final defense. One moment they stood amidst fire and death. The next they stood somewhere else. Sortiarius, a world that did not exist on any star chart, a place with no true position in the galaxy. It had not been discovered, conquered, or created. It had been given. The planet of the sorcerers. It hung in the heart of the Eye of Terror, a demon world unlike any other. A world that mirrored Prospero in its shape and contours. Its spires resembled those lost towers, its skyline the same curvature of Tizca's, except everything was wrong. Mountains bled glass. The skies twisted in colors unseen by mortal perception. Pyramids floated, suspended by threads of sorcery, casting impossible shadows across dunes made of powdered bone. It was beautiful, and it was damning. Magnus was there, waiting. But it was not the Magnus they had known. The flesh remained, but it pulsed with too much power, stretched too thin across something deeper, older, unnatural. His eyes still burned, but now it burned with the reflection of an entire god's will. Wings of scintillating warp light had grown from his back, vast and ethereal. He no longer stood in the warp. He had become part of it. He did not speak when his sons arrived. He did not need to. His thoughts thundered across the dusty, whispering wind like divine law. You are mine. You are saved. And you are changed. The Legion, once scorched and bleeding, knelt, not in reverence, in necessity. The warp coiled around them. They could feel their bodies shifting already. The protections that had held back the flesh change were unraveling again, but this time the mutations were different, hungrier. The warp was no longer held at bay. It was being fed. Some fell to their knees in agony as their bones turned to fire. Others laughed, speaking languages never learned. The Legion was alive, but it was no longer the same. Sortiarius was no gift. It was a gilded prison, a realm shaped by the warp itself to reflect Tzeentch's desire for perfection, knowledge, and chaos all at once. Towers shifted positions when unobserved. Maps were obsolete by the time they were finished. The laws of nature were optional. Time passed unevenly. A year of study might take a moment, or an hour might age a man to dust. Still, the 1,000 Suns rebuilt. They had no choice. They could not return to the Imperium. Prospero was ash, Terra had turned its back, and their own brothers had tried to wipe them from existence. So they did what they had always done. They studied. They learned. They evolved. New cults formed from the fragments of the old. The Pyre expanded their mastery beyond flame to the conjuring of emotion as weapon. The Corvidae ceased merely reading the future and began editing it, constructing spells that could manipulate probability itself. The Athenians no longer read thoughts. They restructured them. Ahriman, broken and embittered, took to the black towers of the north, beginning what would become his true path. He questioned everything, their failure, their curse, the meaning of survival. To him, the events of Prospero had proven that loyalty meant nothing, that only knowledge was eternal, and all around him the Legion agreed. Magnus, now a demon prince of Tzeentch, his soul irrevocably bound to the Changer of Ways, retreated into the crystal labyrinth, a maze of thought and nightmare buried beneath Sortiarius's surface. There, he began building something greater, a psychic map of the entire Imperium, constructed not in space but in will. His mind reached out across the warp, watching, listening, pulling secrets from 1,000 inquisitors, psychers, and rogue archivists without them ever knowing. But though he was ascended, he was not whole. He had given too much. He had broken too deeply. The part of him that once loved Prospero, that once believed in truth and reason and loyalty, was now reduced to a faint echo beneath an ocean of fate. He remembered the names of every son who died in Tisca, but he never spoke them aloud. Instead, he plotted. Time in the eye moved strangely, but for the 1,000 Suns, it became a blessing. Where other traitor legions degenerated into bloodlust and infighting, the 1,000 Suns retreated into the warp storms, becoming elusive phantoms. Centuries passed and they emerged only occasionally, to raid imperial worlds for lost artifacts, to snatch psychers for experiments, or to collapse entire cities with thought alone. To the Imperium, they became legend, nightmares, warlocks of crimson and gold whose bolters roared alongside incantations older than the stars. But within their demonic realm, they were still men, changed, twisted, damned, but still reaching, still searching, still hungry for the truth that had eluded them since the burning of their world. And above them, in his impossible palace, Magnus watched them all, Pride and sorrow twisted into one broken, eternal gaze. He had tried to save them. He had tried to save everyone. Now he ruled over what remained, a legion of ghosts, a planet of lies, a future shaped not by hope, but by inevitability. The flight from Prospero had not saved the Thousand Suns. It had only made them eternal. Time moved differently within the Eye of Terror. Not in the poetic sense, but literally. Years could stretch or collapse. Hours could become centuries, and memory became unreliable currency. But in that place of madness, where stars bled emotion and planets wept sorrow, the Thousand Suns endured. Not by faith, not by loyalty, by purpose, and that purpose was vengeance. In the Cyclopean Tower at the heart of Sortiarius, the impossible citadel Magnus had raised from raw warpstone and fractured dreams, the Crimson King no longer walked as a man. He drifted between dimensions, a being of immense intellect and fury, his physical form now just a symbol of what he had become. Wings of spectral fire trailed behind him, and his voice, when he chose to speak, broke minds before breaking silence. But even demons have regrets. Magnus rarely left the Sanctum Imperial, the inner chamber of his war citadel, where swirling constellations of thought and timelines pulsed around him in a dome of sentient crystal. Here, the Crimson King gazed across the galaxy through mirrored orbs and pools of memory, studying the Imperium not as a nation, but as a flaw, one he had once sought to perfect, now bent on his destruction. He watched his father sit unmoving upon the golden throne, entombed in silence. He watched his brothers fall into madness or rot in their hypocrisy. He watched humanity still grovel in fear of the warp, burning psychers like witches on the very worlds his legion had once enlightened. It was not enough to survive. He would remake everything. But even Magnus the Red, demon and scholar, could not do so alone. Tzeentch watched him still, the god who had caught him in his moment of despair and ascended him, the architect of fate, the master of change, paradox, and manipulation. Their relationship was not one of worship, but of necessity. Magnus had never bent the knee fully. Even in ascension, he remained defiant, a reluctant prince in a court of madness. Tzeentch did not care. It had claimed him all the same. And so the pact was formalized. No ceremony, no blood, just understanding, sealed not in words but in inevitability. Magnus would be given power beyond comprehension, the ability to see through time's veil, to wield the warp as an artist does paint, to command armies of demons and storm worlds with thought alone. In return, he would become the storm, a tool, a weapon, a facet of Tzeentch's endless schemes. His legion would be preserved but not spared. They would grow stronger, yes, but always under the watchful eye of the god who gives only with hidden teeth. Thus did the Crimson King truly become a demon primarch, his soul threaded through the warp like ink in water, his mind fused with the tides of destiny, and the Thousand Suns followed. The cults within the Legion, once scholarly branches of psychic pursuit, evolved into war covens, each aligned to a different principle of Tzeentch's domain. The cult of change, led by the ever-burning Thabor Ikarion, devoted itself to the constant reshaping of matter and identity. The cult of knowledge, under the ancient sorcerer Meresh Ka, hunted forbidden truths and broke minds with revelations. Others, like the cult of schemes and the cult of prophecy, competed not with bolters, but with plans, each legionary a player in a game stretching across galaxies and centuries. They became not just a legion, but an engine of conspiracy. The first worlds to fall were weak ones, isolated imperial outposts along the fringes of the Segmentum Obscurus, places where the light of the Astronomicon was dim and the minds of men were already fraying. The Thousand Suns did not conquer them with force. They whispered into dreams, They turned governors against priests, officers against psychers. Civil wars ignited from nothing but suggestion. And when the blood had soaked the ground, when the air was thick with confusion and fear, then they came. Rubric Marines, silent, dust-filled suits of armor animated by ancient bindings, marched through ruined cities while sorcerers hovered above them, draped in cloaks of sentient shadow, staffs crackling with madness. They took no slaves, no prisoners, only relics, knowledge, secrets. And then they vanished. The Imperium was slow to respond. It had seen demon incursions before. It had endured wars with worse monsters. But this was different. There were no warbands foaming at the mouth, no frothing cults screaming the names of the dark gods. There were only whispers, disappearances, patterns. Entire sectors fell to paranoia and collapse before the Administratum even acknowledged a threat. This was not conquest. It was demonstration. Magnus wanted them to see, to understand what they had cast out, what they had tried to burn in the fires of ignorance. And so he wove his first grand spell. It began on the world of Runeterra, a minor forge world near the Eye, a world obsessed with cataloging genetic deviations, a world that had once declared psychic mutation a virus worse than heresy. There, Magnus enacted a ritual that stretched across the planet's own noosphere. His sorcerers inverted every machine prayer, rewrote every code script, turned the very logic of the Adeptus Mechanicus against itself. The forges screamed as data spirits warped, and red-robed priests clawed out their minds in revelation. When the ritual was complete, the world did not die. It forgot. Every archive, every record, every memory, all of it erased. The forges still burned, the cities still stood, but no one remembered why. The population wandered the ruins like ghosts, speaking in tongues they did not know. The message was clear. We are not forgotten. But you will be. From Sortiarius, the Crimson King watched and said nothing. His eye reflected not the present, but thousands of presents, overlapping, collapsing. In some, he was triumphant. In others, he burned again. In most, he was simply absent, replaced by another version of himself, angrier, sadder, or entirely hollow. And in each vision, one constant remained. The Imperium feared him still. The Thousand Sons no longer needed armies to fight in their name. They became the war behind the war, the corruption beneath the creed. They seeded rogue psychers into imperial institutions, turned navigators against one another with visions of ascension, whispered the locations of black library fragments to desperate agents, only to watch them become vessels of their own doom. It was not about winning. It was about changing the game. But not all within the Legion embraced this path equally. Some, like Ahriman, chafed against the leash of Tzeentch. They had not joined chaos to become slaves to it. Their pact, if it ever truly existed, had been Magnus's, not theirs. And in time, that wound would fester. But for now, they served, not out of loyalty, out of inevitability. The pact had been made. The Emperor had cast them out. The warp had welcomed them in. And the Crimson King would ensure that if he could not save mankind, he would teach it. One lesson at a time, one soul at a time. And when the stars themselves burned with truth, he would be there, eye open, hand outstretched, saying once again, I told you, the skies above Terra boiled with madness, not storm nor weather, nor the breath of a world long past its age, but warp fire. Pale green cyclones howled across the heavens, filled with screaming constellations. Phantasmal wings clawed the void. The stars themselves blinked out one by one. The siege of Terra had begun. For all his schemes, all his knowledge, all his burdens and brilliance, Magnus the Red stood not among the vanguard of the traitor host. The Thousand Sons did not march in force beside the World Eaters or the Death Guard, nor did they swarm the Saturnine bastions in the tens of thousands like their brother legions. When the ruinous tide washed over Terra's ancient crust, the Sons of Prospero were not its spearhead, they were its echo. To the Imperial defenders, this absence seemed almost merciful. Of all the traitor legions, none invoked more unease than the sorcerers of Sortiarius. They had become myths made flesh, incantations with bolt guns, dreams with armor. Their name was spoken only in the stillness between battles, when the warp wind screamed just a bit louder than usual. And yet, Magnus was there. He did not arrive as a general. He did not step forth in armor beneath the banners of his legion. He came as thought, as shadow, as an intrusion upon the veil of the Emperor's inner sanctum, a rift in fate, an echo of a son who had once believed, once served, once loved. He came to Terra alone. Some say he was drawn by pain, that the psychic suffering of the Golden Throne, its endless drain upon the Emperor's soul, acted like a beacon for the Crimson King. Others claim he came not for war, but for something far more dangerous. Closure. Magnus stepped through the veil on the 12th day of the siege, not upon the battlefield, but into the tunnels that wormed beneath the palace. These were places no loyalist walked, no traitor breached. Sealed vaults of obsidian and silence, where light had not touched for centuries. Yet Magnus did not need doors, not anymore. He phased through wards built to stop time. He stepped over traps crafted to devour causality. He was no longer just flesh, he was memory, regret, potential. The echo of what could have been. The custodians who patrolled the deepest sanctums never even saw him. He passed through the gene vaults, past the chamber where his father had first crafted him. The urns and tanks still lined the walls, dust-choked, long abandoned. He ran his hand across a brass plate etched with his own genome. A part of him flinched at the touch. Another part welcomed it. He could feel the Emperor above, burning like a star on the edge of collapse. The Golden Throne was no longer a seat of rule. It was a tomb of necessity. The Emperor did not sit upon it. He battled it. Each second, the master of mankind held back the tide of unreality, threatening to consume Terra through the breach Magnus himself had caused. Through the webway gate his astral body had shattered. Through the wound that still festered, even now behind every scream echoing through the dungeons below. Magnus felt it, and wept. He did not come to gloat. He did not come to strike his father down. He came to speak. The Hall of Wills was a circular chamber, cut from nullstone and embedded with thought-reactive crystal veins. No technology worked here. No demon could pass. But ideas, those always found a way. It was here Magnus stood, alone, and the Emperor came to him, not in form, not in armor, but in projection, a blaze of psychic presence that filled the chamber with golden fury. The Primarch bowed, not in submission but in recognition. Father. The word hung in the air like smoke. There was no answer, only silence. Silence that crushed the breath from the lungs. Magnus stepped forward, his voice quiet, human. I know what I did. I know what I broke. Still nothing. But the walls around him pulsed, a low vibration, judgment. Wordless and absolute. I tried to warn you. I thought I was saving us. I saw what Horus would become, what you would lose. His voice cracked. For a moment he looked like the boy who had stood at the edge of the pyramid on Prospero, watching his father descend from the heavens. I only wanted to be worthy of the name you gave me. The Emperor's presence flared, light without warmth, power without mercy. You were. The voice came not as sound but as feeling, pure absolute truth. Magnus staggered beneath it, and for a single moment his sorceress form dimmed. His wings of thought faltered. The warp recoiled, and then He changed. Whatever part of him had hoped, whatever ember of regret still smoldered, was smothered. Magnus straightened. The sadness did not leave his eye, but the hope did. He turned his back to the throne, to his father, to what might have been. "This is the last time we speak," he said, voice steady now. "Whatever comes next, I no longer fight for you or for mankind. I fight for what they could have been, for what we could have been." And then he vanished, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer of warp light and the scent of burning parchment. Outside the sanctum, the siege continued. The traitor legions clashed with titans and custodians atop mountain-high walls. Blood rained from the skies. The traitor primarchs led apocalyptic assaults, Angron screaming at the gates, Mortarian's plague creeping through the water lines, Perturabo hammering at the defenses like a god of siege. But the Thousand Sons remained elsewhere. Magnus did not commit his legion to the frontal assault. He understood that Terra would not fall by force. Instead, he played a deeper game. In the catacombs beneath the Saturnine Gate, phantoms whispered heresies into the minds of tech adepts. In the Psyker vaults beneath the Sanctus District, entire soul-bound regiments spontaneously combusted, victims of thoughts not their own. On the 5th day of the 2nd month, a custodian archivist in the Echo Vaults opened a sealed codex to find it rewritten in High Prosperoan with a signature, Ahriman. Every page revealed a secret never known. Every secret drove another knife into the Imperium's spine. They were not warriors anymore. They were the disease in the mind of the beast. And when Horus finally stood before the Emperor on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Magnus did not raise his blade to join him. He did not stand with the War Master in triumph or in death. Instead, he stood in the warp, watching the moment unfold. He had once called that man brother. He watched him die. And in the wake of that death, when the traitor legions were cast into the eye, fleeing in shame and fury, Magnus returned not as a broken general, but as a teacher once more. He would not weep for Terra again, but he would make sure that Terra one day wept for him. The eye of Terra bloomed in the aftermath of the heresy, wide and hungry, a wound in reality no longer content to hide in the shadows. And into that howling vortex fled the damned, traitors, broken legions, shattered warbands of once great Astartes, now bereft of purpose, identity, or hope. Among them drifted the Thousand Sons, but unlike their brothers, the blood-slick berserkers of Khorne, the rotting paladins of Nurgle, or the pain-twisted scions of Slaanesh, the sons of Magnus did not fall into madness. They did not splinter into feuding warbands, did not descend into base savagery. They turned inward, into silence, into study. The siege of Terra had broken something deep within the Crimson King. Not just a bone or a belief, but a core truth. He had stood before his father, looked into the golden flame of divinity, and found no forgiveness. His cause had burned, his city had turned to ash, and the galaxy he once tried to uplift had spit on his name. Magnus withdrew to the planet of the sorcerers, not in shame, but in stillness. Sortiarius became a fortress of thought, a labyrinth of magic and obsidian crystal suspended above a chasm of unbound warp storms. Time there did not crawl, it spiraled. Decades could pass in a single breath, or stand still for a century. It was a place where reality bent to will, where the soul of the Legion beat quietly in the halls of dead libraries. But silence does not last in the eye. After Horus fell, there was no new War Master, no order. The traitor legions, stripped of their direction, driven by hatred and hunger, turned on each other. What had once been a coalition of brothers became an empire of cannibal warlords. It was not enough to have survived. Now they wanted dominion. Thus began the Legion Wars. On worlds born of chaos and hate, The Night Lords hunted iron warriors for sport. The Emperor's children transformed planets into shrieking temples of sensation. Word-bearers scoured ancient ruins for relics to offer their dark gods, while the Black Legion began to form under a name not yet cursed, Ezekiel Abaddon. And all the while the Thousand Sons watched. Magnus remained aloof, uninterested in the petty squabbles of his kin. Let them bleed. Let them shriek and tear each other apart. He had seen enough war, enough failure. He had no interest in ruling broken men who no longer remembered why they fought. But his sons were not so still. Within the crystal towers of Sortiarius, a new sickness began to bloom, not of body, but of essence. The flesh change had returned, not as it once was, not the sudden, violent spasms of mutation that tore bodies apart. This was something deeper, slower, a spiritual unraveling. Sorcerers began to notice their forms slipping, voices echoed in strange tongues, eyes grew where none should be, bones grew fractal. Some dissolved into pools of raw warp light, others calcified into statues of screaming perfection. The rubric had failed, or perhaps it had never been enough. The sorcerers had grown in power since the heresy. Too much power. Their bodies, even strengthened by the rubric's protection, could no longer contain what they were becoming. They were conduits for the raw will of Tsiench, and that power demanded change. Ahriman was the first to name the threat. He studied his brothers as they disintegrated. He consulted forbidden tomes, interrogated demons, and even spoke to the librarium's sentient archives, psychic constructs made from the memories of the dead. The conclusion was inescapable. The rubric had staved off the flesh change by destroying the unworthy, but now even the worthy were beginning to buckle under the weight of their own ambition. He approached Magnus. They spoke in the Temple of Reflection, a chamber where one could see every version of oneself that might have been. There, Magnus brooded atop a throne carved from the fossilized bones of forgotten gods, his wings folded around him like a shroud. He did not rise when Ahriman entered. "You see it," Ahriman said. Magnus said nothing. "It's happening again. To all of us, even you." Still nothing. Ahriman stepped forward. "We can fix it." Magnus's voice, when it came, was a low tremor. There is no fixing what was broken at birth. But Ahriman refused to accept that. He had watched too many of their brothers crumble, dissolve, fade into silence. They had sacrificed everything for knowledge, for stability, for survival. He would not let them fade now. Not into madness, not into demonhood. He gathered a cabal, Phosis Tikar's apprentices, the geomancer Hekatar, the scribe witch Menkara, and others whose names are now forbidden. Together, in the deepest vaults of the planet of the sorcerers, they plotted the impossible, to remake the rubric, not to freeze their brothers in amber, but to perfect them, to strip away the chains of mutation, to give the Thousand Sons control over their transformation. Not dust-filled shells, not monsters, but ascendants. What followed was a war, not with bolters or blades, but with philosophy. Magnus forbade the ritual. He saw it not as salvation, but as hubris layered atop the crime that had already damned them. He had paid the price for the first rubric in blood and tears. This time he would not stop the hand of fate. But Ahriman no longer cared for fate, only will. In secret, he and his cabal prepared the rite. They would remake the rubric, not as a prison, but as a key. A masterwork of psychic manipulation that would seize control of the warp-threaded souls of every Thousand Son and reshape them into immortals of the mind. And when the ritual was cast, it worked. At first. For a single blinding moment, the planet of the sorcerers went silent. The warp itself stilled. Every sorcerer on the planet felt it, the promise of clarity, of unity, of wholeness. Then came the screaming. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, does not suffer to be mastered. The spell rebounded. It did not simply fail, it twisted. The warp punished the pride of its servants. Ahriman's mind shattered across dimensions. His cabal perished, some erased, some turned inside out, others cursed to never die. And the rubric was not reborn. It was worsened. Those already entombed in dust remained so. Those few flesh-bound survivors now suffered flickering instability, trapped between real and unreal, flickering with each breath. Some gained new powers, yes, but at terrible cost. Magnus descended from his sanctum. He found Ahriman kneeling in a crater of broken glass and psychic residue, his armor cracked, his eyes full of fire and remorse. The Crimson King did not raise his hand. He simply spoke. "You were my greatest mistake." And with that, he cast Ahriman from the Legion, exiled, banished. The sorcerer who had once been the brightest star of Prospero now drifted alone in the void, his soul branded with Tzeentch's laughter. But the Legion endured, scarred, shamed, but alive. The Empire of Dust did not fall. It transformed. The rubric had become their curse and their salvation. The rubric Marines, their bodies hollow, their minds dormant, became their immortal warriors. Their sorcerers, now fewer and more volatile, grew ever more dangerous. The Thousand Sons had no empire of planets. They needed none. They had an empire of thought, of secrets, of knowledge stolen from 1,000 worlds, hidden in vaults no mind could reach. While the other traitor legions fought over ash and bones, the Thousand Sons prepared. They had not forgotten Prospero. They had not forgiven Terra. And now, even as their souls flickered and changed, they waited for the stars to align, for fate to blink, for the galaxy to forget long enough for them to strike. And in the crystal halls of Sortiarius, the Crimson King sat once more upon his throne, not in sorrow, not in silence, but in patience. The Empire of Dust had settled. Now it would rise. In the shifting half-light of Sortiarius, where the air shimmered with unreality and the stars danced in reverse across a sky that wasn't truly there, the Thousand Sons stood upon the edge of a second extinction. Their homeworld, if the planet of the sorcerers could be called such, had become a mausoleum of potential. The Legion's physical forms, already twisted by exposure to the warp, were decaying further with each passing cycle. Some simply dissolved into raw ether. Others screamed silently as their minds fractured under the pressure of their own growing power. Most horrifying of all, many had begun to suffer the return of the flesh change, long thought conquered. It came subtly this time, fingers lengthening, teeth growing between knuckles, eyes appearing in the hollow of the throat. But it was there, a slow, unraveling rot, a cruel echo of their oldest curse. They were falling again. And in the midst of this dread, Azek Ahriman watched. He was no longer what he had been. Once the chief librarian of the Thousand Sons, most trusted of Magnus's sons, Ahriman had grown colder since the fall of Prospero, more severe. His pursuit of knowledge had become obsession, his calm precision, now fanaticism. He moved through Sortiarius like a phantom, always watching, always studying. He remembered the burning. He remembered the faces of his brothers as they died, some pierced by Fenrisian blades, others disintegrated by their own uncontrollable powers. And he remembered the cost they had paid to survive. Ahriman refused to lose them again. Magnus did nothing. He sat in his towering sanctum, the crystal labyrinth, absorbed by visions of futures no sane mind could understand. The Crimson King had become distant, sometimes maddened, his thoughts forever entwined with the infinite fractals of Tzeentch's design. He spoke in riddles, he issued no commands. He grieved, he watched, but he did nothing. So Ahriman decided he would. The plan took form not as strategy, but as necessity. A ritual, not a common spell, not even a grand summoning, but a rubric, a metaphysical redefinition, a rewriting of what it meant to be a thousand sun. He called it the Akashic Transformation. The purpose was simple, though its scope was godlike: to end the flesh change forever, to purge instability from the Legion's gene seed, stabilize their physical forms, and perfect their ability to channel the warp without being consumed by it. The cost? Ahriman did not know. Not yet. He gathered those few who still believed the Legion could be saved, men like Balek Uthizar, who had memorized the entire Book of Magnus in its original light script, Secutor Carthula, whose voice could control the dreams of a continent, and Hathor Mat, the chronomancer, who had seen too many versions of the future where the thousand suns simply vanished. Together, in the deepest vault of Sortiarius, they built a chamber from the bones of extinct demons and lined it with the black pages of tomes that had never been written. Runes were carved with thought, and blood was offered, not just from the living, but from memories of the dead. The ritual was not cast, it was unleashed. The rubric ignited like a second sun within the heart of the planet of the sorcerers, a flare of impossibility, a detonation of soul and purpose. Every single thousand sun across the world, no matter where they stood, no matter whether they were reading, sleeping, meditating, or fighting demons at the fringes of reality, felt it. And then came the change. Those with strong psychic potential survived the blast. Not untouched, but reborn. Their minds clarified, honed into perfect tools. Their bodies ceased to mutate, instead becoming ideal vessels of discipline and strength. They emerged more powerful, more focused, gods wearing the memory of armor. But those without the gift, they were erased. In an instant, every Astartes of the thousand suns who lacked psychic strength was reduced to ash. Their flesh disintegrated, their screams lost in the warp's silent fury. Yet their armor remained, sealed, standing, their spirits still bound within, anchored by the residual force of the rubric. 1,000 silent sentinels, rubric marines. No breath, no heartbeat, no will of their own. Just the echo of once great warriors, now entombed in ceramite and silence, marching by psychic command alone. Ahriman had saved them, and damned them. The price of stability was identity. When the light faded, the planet was quiet. The warp winds stilled. The libraries no longer trembled with uncontrolled discharges. Mutations stopped. The flesh change was over. And Magnus descended. He appeared not in fury, but in grief. His crimson armor was darker than before, and his eye, once a blazing star of knowledge, now glowed dim with betrayal. He stood before Ahriman, his once favored son, and asked him only one question. Was this your idea of salvation? Ahriman, surrounded by the dust of thousands of brothers, did not answer. Magnus struck. The duel tore across half the planet. Mountains screamed, realities fractured. Rubric marines turned to glass just by proximity. The crystal labyrinth wept starlight as father and son, unleashed power no mortal could describe. In the end, Magnus did not kill him. Tzeentch would not allow it. Instead, Magnus banished him, cast Ahriman from Sortiarius with a single gesture, flinging him into the warp, a soul marked by both brilliance and failure. Exile, eternal. Ahriman became a wanderer, hated by some, feared by many, hunted by none who wished to live. He carved a new path through the galaxy, searching for forbidden knowledge, always seeking a way to undo or perfect the rubric. And on Sortiarius the thousand suns continued. Fewer now, quieter, more ghost than legion. Their rubric marines marched without pause, their sorcerers studied without rest, and Magnus sat upon his floating throne, contemplating futures he no longer cared to prevent. The rubric had done what no war could. It had ensured the survival of the Thousand Suns. But survival is not life. And in the haunted halls of Sorciarius, the question still echoes in silence. Was it worth the price? No one answers. Only the wind whispers in High Prosperoan. In the silence that followed the rubric, Sorciarius did not mourn. It settled. The planet of the sorcerers, once alive with the sound of thought, debate, lectures echoing across hovering monoliths and luminous halls, fell still, not dead, just changed. The rubric Marines, those once fierce sons who had sparred in psychic duels and composed verses in High Prosperoan, now stood like statues across the towers, eternal, expressionless, still clad in crimson and gold, but hollow, filled only with dust and residual spirit, their minds locked away like relics in glass. They did not move unless ordered. They did not speak. And the Thousand Suns sorcerers who remained, the few who had survived the rubric with their minds intact, found themselves walking through halls that no longer echoed with fellowship, but with guilt. Every door that opened revealed another empty chamber. Every step stirred memories of those who no longer breathed. Magnus withdrew. Even deeper than before, he vanished into the twisting folds of the crystal labyrinth, a dimensional space now so unbound by logic that even time hesitated to follow him. He did not rage. He did not scold. He did not weep. He simply left, not from the world, but from his sons. He had seen the cost, and it had broken something that could never be rebuilt. Ahriman remained behind in the aftermath. The arch-sorcerer, architect of the rubric, now walked the streets of a world he had saved and ruined. At first, none spoke to him. Some watched him from a distance. Others avoided him entirely. The warped jinns in the towers whispered of him when they thought he couldn't hear. Familiar spirits refused to return his call. His presence was like oil in sacred water, contaminating everything he touched. But Ahriman, as always, was calm, detached, logical. He believed in the rubric, still did. He walked among the automatons, the rubric Marines, sometimes speaking softly to their empty shells, not apologizing, remembering. Some of those sealed warriors had been his dearest brothers, men whose voices once debated the philosophy of time. Now they stood like tombs with bolters. "Forgive me," he whispered once, touching the pauldron of one who had once been Khalid. But forgiveness never came. Eventually, the council was called. Not by Magnus, he had not been seen in weeks, but by the remaining captains, the most senior of the surviving sorcerers. Menkara of the Iron Sigil, Serafiar the Coilmaster, and Koptir of the Endless Eye. They gathered beneath the Weeping Moon, a metaphysical artifact that hovered above the center of Sorciarius, reflecting not light but memory. Ahriman came when summoned, without fear, without anger. The council chamber was cold, not physically, psychically, the kind of chill only betrayal could bring. Menkara spoke first. "You rewrote what it meant to be one of us, Serafiar. You defied our father's will. You did not consult. You acted." Koptir, quieter than the others, simply said, "You turned our brothers into dolls." Ahriman listened to them all. His hands were folded behind his back, robes pristine. His helm hung at his side, exposing a face both gaunt and ageless. When they were done, he raised his eyes. "I did what Magnus would not," he said. Silence. "I did what must be done." He gestured to the world around them. "They live. We live. No more flesh change. No more disintegration. No more screams in the middle of the night as a brother tears himself apart from the inside." "And at what cost?" Menkara spat. "Survival," Ahriman replied. "That was always the cost. Seraphiar's hands curled into fists, warp light crackling at his fingertips. "You have no remorse," Ahriman turned to him. "I have endless remorse, but I also have vision. What I did is not the end. It is the beginning. We are no longer victims of our gift. Now we are its masters." That was the final straw. A voice rang out, not from the council, but from above. It was Magnus. He had not entered. He simply was, his form unfolding from nothing, coalescing into the chamber like thunderclouds given shape. His wings were furled, but his eye burned. There was no warmth in his expression, only finality. "You are no master," he said, his voice reverberating in every mind present. "You are a thief." Ahriman met his gaze. "You did nothing. You let us rot while you dreamt of futures that never arrived." Magnus descended. "You presume to lecture me? After this?" He gestured outward, at the silent city, the still forms of their brothers frozen in eternal vigilance. "You've turned our legion into a graveyard." "I turned it into a legion that can never die," Ahriman snapped, "and I would do it again." That sealed it. Magnus stepped forward and the labyrinth responded. Columns of thought reality flaring to life, whispering forgotten names. Ahriman stood his ground, staff clutched tight, the warp coiling around him. "I should destroy you," Magnus said softly. "I should unmake you in mind and spirit and scatter your essence across 1,000 dead worlds." But then he raised his hand and stopped. Tzeentch loomed, not visibly, not directly, but its presence pressed against the fabric of the room. The architect of fate had plans for Ahriman. The Primarch, even as a diamond prince, could feel the coiling leash of his patron god. "I can't kill you," he muttered, "because he won't let me." Magnus's voice dropped to a whisper, thunderous in its venom. "So I will do the next best thing." With a word, with a gesture, Ahriman was cast out. The warp screamed as it opened around him, a vortex of unreality and soundless fury. Chains of unmaking wrapped around his limbs, dragging him from Sortiarius. A final verdict not of death, but of separation. "Exile," Magnus said, "forever. You are no longer of this legion, no longer my son." And Ahriman was gone. He emerged in the void, cast adrift between dimensions, scattered across the tides of chaos. Alone, but not broken. He drifted for days, years, moments. It was all the same, in the warp. Eventually he found a place to land. Not a world, a possibility. From there he began again. He gathered followers, not loyalists, not brothers, tools, warlocks, sorcerers, renegades, psychers, and warbands with no home, only hunger. He called them the Cabal of Dust, and he began to search, not for absolution, but for perfection. He would refine the rubric. He would undo the flaws, unlock the trapped minds of the rubric Marines, and forge a legion that truly transcended flesh and fate. He would become what Magnus had feared, not a savior, a Varaslo Kirali. And far away on Sortiarius, the silence remained. The rubric Marines stood unmoving. The sorcerers whispered in lower voices. And Magnus the Crimson King watched all his sons, those who remained and those now lost, and wondered which had truly damned them, the one who broke the Legion, or the one who tried to save it. The warp has no maps, no true roads. It is a sea without shoreline, a thought that cannot be completed, a storm that sings your name in voices, not your own. And yet, Ahriman walked it. Banished from Sortiarius, stripped of his brotherhood, his name spat like a curse by the Crimson King himself. Ahriman did not vanish. He did not cower in forgotten corners of the galaxy. He did not break. He simply began again. He drifted for years or moments. Time means little where nightmares sleep and stars scream with laughter. His soul, heavy with regret but hardened with purpose, cut through the imperium like a shard of obsidian through silk. He was a pariah among traitors, an outcast even among those who consorted with demons. Not because he was reviled, because he was feared. He had rewritten the nature of a legion. He had bound souls to armor. He had shaped the warp itself, not just called upon it, but commanded it. And though Magnus had cast him into the void, though Tzeentch twisted fate in infinite layers, Ahriman remained, and he had a goal: to perfect the rubric. Not for forgiveness, not even to undo his sins, but because he had to. Because to leave it unfinished would be to admit defeat, and defeat was an alien concept to Azek Ahriman. He first gathered followers from the detritus of shattered warbands, renegade psychers, failed cult leaders, shattered Astartes who had no god to cling to. To these outcasts, Ahriman offered not brotherhood, but clarity. He did not demand worship. He offered understanding, a purpose. They became the cabal of dust. Each wore robes marked with ever-changing sigils. Each bore minds trained to fracture and reform under pressure. Not loyal, not even trustworthy, but useful. That was all Ahriman needed. Their first destination was the world of Mordask, a dead moon caught between two warp tides. Its surface was littered with shattered black Templars and petrified word-bearers, both armies reduced to stone in some forgotten battle. Beneath its crust lay the bones of a psychic civilization that had predated even the Eldar. Ahriman did not come for trophies. He came for glyphs, psychic geometries encoded in basalt, written in thought language. It took 6 months to extract. 3 members of his cabal were driven mad. 1 was liquefied. Ahriman was unmoved. From Mordask he ventured to the hollow archives of Voxt, a derelict black ship lost in the warp, now orbiting a screaming planetoid. Inside, trapped souls of unsanctioned psychers still burned, condensed into crystalline libraries that sang when touched. Ahriman plundered their knowledge, mapping the edges of soul binding, memory distortion, and astral compression. He lost an eye there, not the physical one, the inner one, the eye of foresight. It would take a century to regrow. Still, he pressed on. He began to experiment. On himself, on his followers, on the few rubric marines he had brought with him from Soriarius, their souls locked inside unyielding ceramite like statues buried alive. He tried to speak to them. Sometimes he would sit for hours in silence beside one of his rubric marines, reciting memories aloud, names, faces, jokes they once told, lessons once learned on Prospero's shining avenues. No response, just the faint, constant hiss of psychic heat emanating from within. He began to devise spells, not crude rituals, but intricate weavings of thought and intent, layered in mathematical rhythm, encoded with the geometry of sorrow and structure. He thought if he could find the right angle, the right tone, he could unlock them. It never worked. They would twitch, shudder. Sometimes a hand would tremble. Once one of them turned its head slightly, just slightly, toward Ahriman when he said the word Tizka. But it was not consciousness. It was reflex. Ahriman did not stop. His cabal changed constantly. Some left seeking easier conquests. Others died to demonic backlash or psychic implosion. One, a former Grey Knight turned renegade named Veskal, tried to kill Ahriman in his sleep. Ahriman incinerated him with a whisper, then studied the ashes. More than once the Thousand Sons tried to kill him. Serafiar, from the Cult of Schemes, sent demon assassins born from his own forgotten thoughts. Minkara tried to collapse a warp corridor Ahriman was traveling through by detonating a conceptual black hole. Even Magnus himself once hurled a psychic storm across a dozen systems, screaming Ahriman's name in a dozen languages of grief. It didn't matter. Ahriman survived. Always, because he had to. And slowly, he began to succeed on the dead forge world of Kavost. Deep in a vault sealed by the prayers of extinct machine gods, he found a relic, the Helix Occultum, a shard of pre-imperial technology designed to store personality echoes inside armor. It was primitive, crude, but it proved that a soul could be preserved, perhaps freed. With it, he modified his spells. On the orbital library of a rogue navigator house, he found star charts not of planets, but of emotions, soul maps used to steer dreams instead of ships. He dissected the idea, wove it into the rubric's structure, and tested it again. And then, on a nameless planetoid where the warp itself recoiled in fear, Ahriman heard a voice. Not a demon, not Tziench, not some new curse, but a rubric marine, one of his oldest, one who had once been first sergeant on Prospero. The voice was broken, hollow, barely more than a psychic whisper. Ahriman. It lasted less than a second, but it happened. For the first time since the rubric, a rubric marine spoke. He collapsed in his sanctum that day, not from exhaustion, but from joy. The soul had not been destroyed, only locked. Ahriman now knew it could be done. His cabal did not celebrate. They didn't understand. They never had. But Ahriman felt it. For the first time in centuries, perhaps millennia, he felt hope. Not just for the rubric, but for redemption. Not the Emperor's, not Magnus's, his own. He resumed his pilgrimage. With greater urgency, he spoke to rogue inquisitors under veiled truce. He tore secrets from the minds of dying Eldar farsers. He mapped the black libraries of Toe soul space, whispered to imprisoned Satan, and even bargained with harlequins under starlit stages made of memory. Always he searched, always he walked. He would not rest until his brothers spoke again, until they remembered, until the Legion remembered. And across the galaxy the name Ahriman became legend. Traitor, sorcerer, madman, visionary, prophet, monster. He was all of these things, and more. He was the last true son of Prospero, still walking, still seeking, still trying to fix what was broken, not by hatred, not by vengeance, but by love, even if it killed him, even if it damned him all over again. The warp winds howled across the surface of Sortiarius. They carried no scent, no heat, only memories, fragmented and sharpened like broken glass. Names whispered in the dust. Khalid, Izar, Nibtau, names that once meant something. Now they clung to empty shells of armor, haunted by souls locked in silence. The planet of the sorcerers had changed. Since Ahriman's exile, the Crimson King no longer walked among his sons. Magnus remained sequestered deep within the labyrinth, a creature of prophecy and fury, half god and half memory. The remaining 1,000 sons operated in near autonomy, the surviving sorcerers divided among their cults, Pyrae, Corvidae, Athenians, and more, each pursuing their own strands of Tzinch's labyrinthine favor. They warred not with bolters, but with knowledge. Plots unfolded across star systems like falling dominoes. Rituals bent reality to reshape entire civilizations. Imperial bastions turned upon themselves after waking from years-long dreams that were never dreams at all. The 1,000 Suns were shadows in the seams of the galaxy, unseen but felt, felt but ungrasped. But not all shadows are content to remain in hiding, and not all betrayals are past. A whisper reached Sortiarius, a whisper carried through the warp like a flicker in the ether. A voice long thought exiled, a name spoken in curses, prophecy, and bitter longing. Ahriman. He was alive. Worse, he was succeeding. Reports filtered through the cabals of the 1,000 Suns like infection. On the dead hive world of Cadralis, an entire garrison of rubric marines had begun to move of their own volition, without command. On the ash wastes of Albedoc Prime, one had been heard to speak. Only a word. One word. Free. And on Gadriel's gate, a rubric warrior had crumbled into dust, willingly, after uttering a full verse of a Prosperoan poem long lost to all but the most ancient archives. They said it was Ahriman, that he had found a way, that his obsession had borne fruit. And that was when the War of the Forgotten Sons began. It was not declared, there was no formal campaign, but across the warp corridors, through the blackened nebulae and the haunted sectors where few dared tread, Ahriman's name became both rallying cry and death sentence. Magnus gave no order. He didn't need to. His sons acted for him. From the cult of schemes came warbands led by the twin soul Magus Vitenar, once a student of Ahriman, now his most bitter enemy. From the Corvidae came vision seers who had traced futures in which Ahriman's success unmade the Legion entirely. And from the cult of Pyrrhae came the harrowing flame, warriors whose psychic fire scoured entire planets clean of his influence. They hunted him. Ahriman did not run. He answered, not with armies, not with worlds, but with truth. At the edge of the Malachite Rift, he unveiled the Vault of Urdex, a time-locked artifact containing the souls of 5 rubric Marines, fully restored to lucidity. Their testimony, recorded in warp-stabilized crystal, spread through the warp like a heretical virus. "We remember Prospero," one said. "We dream of the library. We are awake." Ahriman released the message not to the Imperium, not to mortals, but to his brothers. He sent it to Sortiarius, to Magnus, and in doing so he forced a question into the hearts of every surviving sorcerer. What if he was right? The civil war that followed was psychic in nature, ideological in form, and lethal in practice. Thousand Sons turned on Thousand Sons, not in hate but in purpose. Some believed the rubric must remain untouched, that to tamper with it again was to risk annihilation. Others saw in Ahriman's words a flicker of the city they had lost, a glimpse of Tisca, gleaming once more in memory, not as it was, but as it could be. On the planet Nyx, 2 rival covens clashed in silence. They never spoke, never fired a shot. They simply thought at one another, words, spells, emotion given shape. Minds fractured like mirrors struck with hammers. At the end, the surface of the world was a landscape of screaming thought wraiths, but Ahriman's envoy left with 5 new recruits. On Erebus Null, a sorcerer named Thelicon rebelled. He unlocked his own rubric guard using a fragment of the ritual Ahriman had scattered through psychic song. The rubric Marines did not speak, but they wept. Golden tears. Thelicon and his warband disappeared into the warp that same hour, headed for Ahriman's sanctuary. Sortiarius convulsed. Magnus did not stir, but the great eye turned, for Tzeentch had seen something in all this, not failure, not victory, change. It all came to a head above the dead star Azuz-Ran, a planet of black glass and broken orbits where time hung suspended in webs of false memories, and reality echoed with voices that never existed. Here, the Thousand Sons, loyal to Magnus's silence, met those who had begun to whisper Ahriman's name with reverence instead of revulsion. They did not talk. They warred. It was a battle fought across 9 dimensions, each layer a different version of reality, each strike a thought embedded in potential. Sorcerers became serpents of pure equation, hurling theories as spears, while rubric Marines clashed like statues on strings. Time reversed, battles repeated, a planet was shattered in one timeline and restored in another. For every death, a new possibility unfolded. Ahriman stood at the center, clad in robes stitched from paradox, eyes burning with unbearable knowledge. He did not raise a hand. He raised a name. Prospero. The battlefield stopped, even for a second, even among enemies. That was enough. In that pause, in that breath of memory, Ahriman cast a single spell, one he had been perfecting since his exile. He did not aim it at the enemy. He aimed it at his own rubric marines. And they woke. Not all, not many, but enough. They turned their heads. Some cried out. Some dropped their weapons. One screamed the name of his wife. Another chanted the oath of loyalty spoken before the pyramid of Photep. And suddenly, the silence that had defined the Thousand Suns for so long was shattered. The enemy broke, not in body, in belief. They saw the truth. Ahriman's sin had not been hubris. It had been hope. The War of Forgotten Sons did not end in fire. It ended in retreat. Magnus did not appear, but Ahriman's message had been delivered. A new split formed in the Legion, not one of banners, but of intention. Some remained on Sortiarius, loyal to the Crimson King's despair. Others slipped away quietly, seeking Ahriman in the void. They were not a legion anymore. They were ideas, competing, evolving, refusing to die. But in the depths of his sanctum, Magnus felt it, a change in the wind. For the first time in millennia, one of his sons had made the rubric speak again. The echo of Tisca was no longer a memory. It was a movement, and the legion stirred. There is a place hidden in the deepest folds of the warp, where even demons speak in whispers, and light forgets how to shine. It is not marked on any star map, nor can it be found by logic or prophecy. It exists outside of cause, on the border of concept and remembrance. The Thousand Suns call it Athesia, though none alive know if that was ever its true name. Athesia was not a fortress. It was a wound, and it bled secrets. Only Ahriman knew how to reach it. Long ago, during his earliest wanderings through the warp, after his exile, the arch-sorcerer had followed a trail of echoes, scraps of dreams forgotten by dead gods, fragments of half-uttered demonic riddles, patterns hidden in the screaming of warp storms. The path led to a place that should not have been, a hollow world blacker than night, whose surface seemed to absorb even thought. It was here that he found the vault of the Prophet King. No doors, no walls, just an endless descent through a tear in reality, guarded by silence. It was not made. It was remembered into being. A mausoleum built not from stone, but from memory, the last sanctuary of a being who had glimpsed the deepest truths of the warp and chosen to die rather than share them. The Prophet King was long gone, but his dreams remained. Layered upon each other like the strata of a dead world, each chamber of the vault contained a different truth. Not truths of history or power, but truths of potential. Ahriman entered with caution, as he always did, but even he could not have prepared for what he found. The first chamber was sound. It spoke in languages no throat had ever formed, in vibrations that vibrated the soul rather than the air. Choral mantras composed of future possibilities, unfinished poems about what Prospero might have been if the Council of Nicaea had ended differently. Ahriman listened and wept, for the first time since exile. The second chamber was light, colors without name, shimmering across walls that did not exist. The light sang, and within its radiance, Ahriman saw every version of himself he had never become. Loyalist, martyr, martyr-slayer, corpse. One laughed back at him with his own voice, clad in the golden armor of a Lord Commander of Terra. Another wept with the shattered helm of Magnus in his hands. He walked on. He passed rooms built of regret and corridors shaped from questions. Dreams lingered like smoke. Names etched into nothingness twisted as he passed. Menkara, Karlophus, Seraphiar, Phocis Takar, names he had betrayed, names he still carried. And then he found the heart of the vault. It was not a throne, nor a sanctum, nor a chamber at all. It was a mirror, floating, spinning, suspended in a non-place, without ground or ceiling. A polished silver surface that reflected nothing, because it did not show what was. It showed what could be. When Ahriman stepped before it, he saw not himself. He saw Tizca, restored, its pyramids gleaming, its banners flying not with the 8-pointed star of chaos, but the eye of Prospero. The city floated upon an ocean of stars, unburdened by gravity or fear. A legion walked its streets, not automatons, not demons, but men. Warriors clad in scarlet and gold, their helms removed, their voices clear, speaking in high Prosperoan with joy. He stepped closer. In this vision he saw Magnus, not shattered, not winged, not broken, just his father as he had once been, standing in the great library of Photep, surrounded by students, teaching, smiling. He saw himself, younger, proud, not yet so hollow, and he saw rubric Marines, no longer rubric, whole again, their voices restored, their names unforgotten. Ahriman fell to his knees, because he believed it. This was not a lie, this was not some trap woven by Tzeentch to ensnare his ambition. This was the truth behind the truth, a vision of what still could be if the correct path was taken. The rubric could be perfected, not reversed, completed. The locked souls of the 1,000 Sons could be freed, not through brute force or madness, but through understanding. The vault had shown him the final equation. He spent 100 days there, or perhaps 100 years. The warp is a poor timekeeper, but when he emerged, his eyes no longer burned with fire. They burned with purpose. The galaxy was burning again. The Imperium was cracking, shadows falling across Segmentum Solar. The Cicatrix Maledictum had torn the sky in two. Half the galaxy now lay in darkness. And with the coming of this new age of madness, Ahriman re-entered history. He did not attack. He arrived on the world of Gaemon Rael, where the Black Templars had driven out a word-bearer's cult. Ahriman descended in a ship made of sapphire glass. He stepped onto the battlefield and offered aid, not to the Imperium, but to the fallen rubric Marines who lay strewn across the field. They were not his, but their minds still hummed with resonance. He knelt beside one, spoke the name Atum, and the Marine moved. Ahriman began his work again, not with destruction, but with restoration. At first, the Imperium didn't know what to make of it. Some whispered that 1,000 Sons sorcerer was stealing the dead. Others said he was raising ghosts. Still others called it a trap, a slow corruption campaign waged through mercy. But to those he touched, to the scattered rubric Marines who answered his call, it was salvation. They began to call him the Prophet King. It was heresy, it was hope, and it terrified Magnus. From within the folds of the crystal labyrinth, the Crimson King saw visions of his son, no longer exiled but revered, worshipped, building something new, building something better. He tried to look away, but Tzeentch would not let him, because this was the change the god had always desired. The 1,000 paths of the future now forked again, and in half of them, Magnus fell, not to the blade of an enemy, but to the rising tide of belief in a different future, one carried by the sun he had cast out. The vault of the Prophet King had shown Ahriman more than a dream. It had shown him how. And now, as sorcerers across the warp whispered in quiet tones, as rubric Marines began to twitch in their endless vigil, as the planet of the sorcerers found itself shaken not by war, but by longing, the Legion stirred once more, not toward chaos, not toward vengeance, but toward a voice from beyond exile, from beyond silence. And it said only this: we can be whole again. Across the warp-split galaxy, the name Ahriman began to carry a new weight, not only as sorcerer, exile, or villain of Prospero's past, but as something far more dangerous: possibility. Where once the Thousand Sons had fractured into isolated cabals, silent legions of dust bound to the whims of fate, now whispers surged across demon-haunted space like a storm of meaning. Sorcerers who had meditated for centuries now stirred in their pyramids. Long frozen minds turned toward the horizon once more, not all in loyalty, not all in belief, but in curiosity, because the rubric had always been seen as final, immutable, a curse accepted as price for survival, and Ahriman had rewritten it, and in the shadows of Sortiarius, in the libraries no one dared speak in aloud, a single question festered: what if he was right? Those who still served Magnus in silence clung to his apocalyptic visions, content to let the legions smolder in prophecy and pain. But others, those who remembered Tizca before the flames, began to meet in secret. They gathered in places forgotten by the planet of the sorcerers, far from the Cyclopean king's gaze, in ruined spires and echoing memory halls. They called themselves the Ninth Path. The original cults of the Thousand Sons had numbered 9, each aligned to a specific psychic discipline: the Pyre, the Corvidae, the Raptora, and so on. But the Ninth Path had never existed. It had never needed to, until now. This new cult was not devoted to fire or foresight, to change or control. It was not defined by the powers it wielded, but by its intent. The desire not for destruction, not even for dominance, but for restoration. It had no formal leader, no official sigils, but all who joined shared one vision: to reclaim the lost voices of the rubric. To them, the rubric was no longer a curse. It was an unfinished ritual, a chain with one link missing. And Ahriman's forbidden experiments were the first chisel strikes against that lock. The Ninth Path operated in secrecy, even on Sortiarius itself, where every wall was a mouth and every shadow a spy. They managed to remain hidden, because they did not act as radicals. They moved quietly, posing as loyalists to Magnus's sorrowful throne, gathering fragments of forbidden lore, pieces of soul prayers, recordings of rubric marines showing even the faintest flicker of awareness. Their first success came in the catacombs beneath the obsidian mirror, an ancient psychic reflector buried beneath Sortiarius's surface, once used for meditative training before the heresy. There, a sorcerer named Tamat En crafted a ritual inspired by Ahriman's techniques, but refined with the Ninth Path's additions. Soul anchors derived from Eldar spirit stones, emotion-binding glyphs etched with sacrificial memory, and a newly discovered resonance pattern pulled from warp sound extracted from one of the vault's dream chambers. The subject was a rubric marine named Kar Remek, a former shield captain during the defense of the Great Library of Tizca. He had not moved in over 7,000 years. They performed the rite in silence, surrounded by ancient banners and the fading sigils of Prospero's city watch. It was not flashy. No warp flames, no screaming demons, just a low humming tone, barely more than a breath, and the smell of forgotten dust. And then Karemek turned his head, only slightly. Then his fingers moved, a tremble, a twitch, and finally, he spoke. Not a word, not a sentence, just a name. Talaris. No one in the Ninth Path recognized it. No record of that name existed in their libraries, but the sorcerers began to weep, because it was something. A name pulled from the black sea of silence, proof that a voice still lived inside the armor. Kar Remek did not speak again. He soon returned to stillness, but he had spoken. Word spread quickly, too quickly. Within hours, Magnus knew. The Crimson King did not descend from his sanctum, nor did he call for death. Instead, he simply gazed into the warp for days. He looked not at his legion, but at the fabric of fate itself. at the past he had once lived, at the paths not taken. He saw Prospero unburned, saw himself guiding a legion of scholars still whole, still proud, saw Ahriman at his side laughing once again. He screamed. The labyrinth shook, statues of memory cracked. The sky of Sorciarius bled downward in streaks of starlight and warp fire. Because deep inside, the truth hurt more than betrayal. It was hope. He wanted it to be true. But if it was true, it meant he had failed twice, first in condemning his legion to stagnation, and second in casting away the only one who had tried to save it. Still, Magnus made no move to stop the ninth path. Perhaps, somewhere beneath his fury, a fragment of the teacher he had once been still listened. Elsewhere, Ahriman watched the ripple grow. He did not interfere. He did not attempt to lead the ninth path. He allowed it to evolve without his hand, because he understood now, finally, that salvation could not come from one man. Not even him. It had to be shared. He focused instead on the next phase of the restoration. Unlocking memories. If a rubric marine could remember one word, then perhaps they could remember an oath, a story, a life. He ventured to the remains of the Moon of Sighs, where the Black Library of the Eldar had once whispered through hidden gates. He negotiated with harlequins, played games with Segorak's illusions, and bartered with secrets. He left with a shard of crystallized remembrance, an Eldar mnemonic seed, capable of storing a single consciousness for 10,000 years. He would use it as a key. One memory, one soul, set free. The ninth path expanded, slowly, quietly. Some called them fools, others called them heretics, even among the Thousand Sons. But none could deny what they were doing. Rubric Marines that had stood in silence for millennia now turned their heads when spoken to. Some even followed specific individuals without command. They were not alive, not yet, but they were awakening. The rubric was changing, not breaking, evolving. And as the Legion continued its slow-motion collapse, or its rebirth, depending on who told the tale, a final truth began to settle across Sorciarius, across the warp, across the eyes of demons and dreamers alike. The ninth path was not just a cult. It was a return, not to chaos, not to loyalty, but to Prospero, to a dream that refused to die. And in the shadows of a dying galaxy, that dream now stirred in crimson armor, behind featureless helms, in voices choked by dust and time. Waiting to be heard again. It began with silence, as it always had. But this silence was different. Not the cold, empty hush of still armor or the echoing void within a sealed helm. This silence was poised, tense, like the breath before a word is spoken. On Sorciarius, beneath the violet sky that twisted like thought made visible, the Rubric Marines stood across the black stone fields as they always had, unmoving, eternal, dust-bound in rune-sealed ceramite, watchers of a dying world that remembered too much. And then one of them turned his head. No command, no sorcerer's guidance, no psychic leash. Just a motion, slow, uncertain, like a man waking from a dream he had forgotten he'd been dreaming. His name was Ka Raish. Before the rubric, he had been a philosopher-soldier of the Corvidae, a diviner whose voice had once echoed through the high halls of probabilistic thought. He had debated Ahriman himself. He had laughed in the quiet courts of the Pyramid of Eternity. He had lived. And now, after 10,000 years of silence, something deep within him stirred. A hum, a rhythm, a memory not remembered but felt. He took a step forward. The motion rippled across the field. Others stirred. 5, 10, then 30. All rubric Marines, all untouched for millennia. The ninth path scattered cultists and sorcerers who had once operated in secret, gathered in awe as the impossible unfolded. They had waited for signs, for flickers of response, for coded signals within the static of the rubric eye's stillness. They had not expected this. Ka-Raish turned his head fully toward a ninth path magus named Nizikar, a scholar of memory prisms and soul resonance theory. Nizikar, visibly trembling, stepped forward. "Do you know me?" he asked in high Prosperoan. Ka-Raish raised a hand, not a weapon, not in threat, but in recognition. And then he spoke. "Your voice was the first thing I heard." Nizikar fell to his knees, weeping. Across Sortiarius, the warp shivered. 1,000 rubric marines did not awaken. There was no great miracle, no chorus of voices. But the pattern had changed. Dozens twitched, turned, hummed with latent resonance. Some responded to names. Some followed old paths. One was seen saluting a statue of Magnus without command. Another knelt in a ruined observatory and placed a broken lens back in its frame. The rubric was cracking, not collapsing, changing, evolving. The ninth path called it the second breath. To the loyalist imperium, it meant nothing. To the Grey Knights, it was an omen of escalation. To the Ordo Malleus, a red flag. To the other Chaos Legions, it was a curiosity. Even the other Chaos gods, vast and unfathomable as they were, seemed uncertain. Tzeentch merely watched, amused, indifferent, or quietly delighted. But to the 1,000 Suns, it was a fracture in the prison they had mistaken for their sanctuary. Magnus felt it, of course. He felt Ka-Raish speak, not through Vox or mind link, but through the threads of fate, like a pulse in his own soul. For Ka-Raish had been one of his students long ago, one Magnus had praised for his clarity of thought and elegant oration. The Crimson King emerged from the labyrinth. For the first time in centuries, he walked the surface of Sortiarius. The planet trembled beneath his step. Warp light bent around him. Sorcerers scattered before him in reverence, terror, awe. Even the rubric marines instinctively turned their heads, as if the memory of their gene sire still resonated in whatever fragment of soul remained inside them. Magnus did not rage. He did not strike. He stood before Ka-Raish and stared at him for a full hour, unmoving. Then he said softly, "You should not be able to speak." Ka-Raish said nothing. Then slowly he removed his helm. The face beneath was skeletal, dust fused with ceramite, but the eyes, what little remained of them, gleamed with something new, not rage, not power, but awareness. Magnus turned away. He returned to the labyrinth and did not emerge again. But this time it was not grief that sealed his doors. It was thought. Because something had happened that defied all logic, all prophecy. A rubric marine had spoken. The ninth path gained momentum. They were no longer heretics. They were pioneers, scholars, restorers. They built new temples, not to chaos, not even to Magnus, but to memory, to Prospero. They reconstructed the architecture of the old city, drawing on fragments of design stored in soul-resonant echoes. They spoke to rubric marines as one might speak to a sleeping brother. They recorded every twitch, every gesture, every flicker of response. They cataloged partial awakenings. Some rubric marines began to follow specific individuals. One carried an ancient book across the planet, placing it in what had once been a library, without ever being told to do so. Ahriman did not return to Sortiarius, but his influence was everywhere. His texts, once forbidden, were now read aloud in meditations. His early equations were layered into rituals, and his concept of the rubric as unfinished work became foundational dogma to the ninth path. Of course, not all agreed. There were still those within the Legion who called it blasphemy, who saw the rubric as salvation, not imprisonment. Some believed the awakening Marines were a trick, a trap. that Tzeentch was simply playing with them, leading them into a false hope that would end in madness. Skirmishes broke out, silent wars in hidden vaults. One temple was destroyed entirely by a warp fire conjured by a loyalist faction. A sorcerer of the Pyre cult burned his own rubric honor guard when one of them recited a poem he hadn't heard in 10,000 years. "It's not real," he had screamed before incinerating them. But for every act of doubt, 2 more confirmations came. One rubric marine wept, actual tears, golden and slow, leaking from a fused helm. Another played a fragment of music on an ancient stringed instrument, one that had not been tuned since the burning of Prospero. Another reached for the sky with both arms as the reconstructed pillars of a new pyramid of Photep rose beneath starlight. They were remembering. The Ninth Path released their findings in waves, broadcasts of pure psychic resonance sent not through comms, but through dreams. They allowed sorcerers across the galaxy, even those outside the Legion, to feel the awakening. It spread. On Gnosis Prime, a wandering rubric squad stopped fighting and turned their weapons away from a fleeing Imperial convoy. They stood still for an hour, then vanished into the warp. On Nakrion's breath, an entire temple of Ahrimanite scholars burst into white fire, but left behind a single phrase etched in their ashes. "He is not forgotten, and neither are we." The rubric had spoken, not with words alone, but with meaning. And so the Ninth Path, once heresy, became something else, not doctrine, not faith, a movement of dust and remembrance, of lost sons reclaiming their breath, of ghosts becoming men again. And somewhere deep in the endless corridors of the Crystal Labyrinth, Magnus the Red sat alone in a chamber of mirrors. Each mirror showed a version of Ka Raish. In one, the warrior knelt. In another, he stood proud. In another, he held the shattered remains of a staff Magnus once gave him as a gift. And in the last, he turned and walked away. Magnus stared at that mirror longest, and though no one saw him, he whispered a word, not in power, not in prophecy, but in memory. Tizca, and the mirror wept. The galaxy burned, rifts split through the firmament, empires collapsed into silence. The Astronomicon flickered like a dying candle, and across 10,000 systems, the stars whispered promises of salvation that were lies born from madness. And still, amidst this ruin, the Thousand Suns endured. Not as a unified legion. Those days had long passed. They existed now as echoes of themselves, fractured shards of a memory none dared fully mourn. Some served the dark will of Tzeentch in pursuit of power and revelation. Others wandered the void, scholars without temples, wielders of spells that bent time and soul alike. A few, more than most would believe, stood apart from gods entirely, seeking not dominion, but understanding. And above them all, the 2 who had broken the Legion, and in their breaking defined its destiny, remained. Magnus, Ahriman, father and son, king and exile, the dreamer and the fire. The tension between them now stretched across reality like a fault line, no longer just personal, but cosmic. The great game of the gods watched it with interest, Tzeentch most of all. For even the changer of ways, infinite and ever-changing, could not predict what came next, because something impossible was happening. The rubric was ending, not with a roar, not with cataclysm, but like a knot quietly untying after millennia of tension. The Ninth Path had become more than a movement. It had become a resonance, a psychic frequency threading its way through the warp, echoing from world to world, rubric marine to rubric marine. They were awakening, not all at once, not entirely, but enough. At first it had been names, then memories, now full voices, full choices. A rubric marine on the forge world of Elmyros spoke an entire litany of Prospero and battle rights before stepping in front of a firing line to save a civilian family. On Siron Halas, a rubric unit fell upon a pack of Khorne berserkers, not for blood or god, but to avenge a murdered Astartes librarian whose name they had once known. And far in the galactic east, a warband of rubric warriors built a structure stone by stone, without direction, until they had reconstructed a perfect replica of the outer dome of the Pyramid of Photep. The ninth path no longer asked if salvation was possible. They began to ask, what happens when we succeed? Ahriman stood at the edge of this miracle, and for the first time in 1,000 years, he hesitated. Because now the question was not how to restore his brothers. It was what came after. He stood aboard his ship, the Athenaeum of Dust, watching the rubric marines kneel in a silent formation on the starlit observation deck. Not out of obedience, but habit, muscle memory, residual reverence for something long past. And slowly one of them rose. His name, recovered only weeks earlier, was Akem Ra. Once a poet, once a warrior, now a man again. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Ahriman's shoulder. "Where is Prospero, father?" he asked, and Ahriman, eyes glimmering beneath his helm, whispered, "It never left us." But while the rubric crumbled, something else awakened, older, darker, buried beneath layers of prophecy, pain, and purpose. Magnus stirred. He had watched his legion change, not through orders, but through remembrance. The sons he had once ruled with pride now looked not to him, but to the memory of what he had been. And that was the wound. Because Magnus had not forgotten Prospero, he had abandoned it. In his grief, in his rage, he had retreated into prophecy and demonhood, convincing himself that there was no salvation, only cycles of ruin and rebirth. But now, he saw a future he had not written, a path he had not foreseen, and it terrified him. He stood once more before the mirror of fates in the deepest hollow of the crystal labyrinth. The mirror did not lie. It never had. This time it showed him himself as he once had been, not in armor, not in wings, in robes of ochre and gold, a teacher, a father, and behind him the legion, whole, speaking, laughing, fighting, and Ahriman. Beside him, not as servant, as equal, he fell to one knee, not in worship, but in despair. "I wanted to save them," he whispered, and from the mirror the echo returned. "Then why did you stop trying?" They met one last time, on the edge of a world that did not exist until they both arrived. Ahriman stepped from his ship with no guards, no cabal, only his staff and a data vault encoded with the latest harmonics of the restored rubric marines. Magnus descended in silence, his wings furled, his form half ethereal. For once he did not burn with warp light. He looked tired. They stared at one another across the obsidian field. Magnus spoke first. "You've done it." Ahriman inclined his head. "Only the beginning. The rest will take time." A long pause. The warp wind sighed across the plain. "You defied me," Magnus said. "I did. You tore apart our legion." "I did that too." Magnus looked away. "And yet they speak again." Ahriman stepped forward. "They remember you." Magnus flinched. "They remember Prospero," Ahriman continued. "Not as a ruin. As home." Magnus looked up. His eye burned with memory. "Is it too late?" "No," Ahriman said, "but it cannot be undone. It must be rebuilt." They stood in silence, two titans, two sorcerers, two fathers to the same dying dream. And in that silence, something changed. Magnus extended his hand. "I cannot lead them again," he said. "Then walk beside them," Ahriman replied. For a moment, nothing moved. Then slowly, achingly, Magnus placed his hand on his son's shoulder, and the warp shivered. Not in rage, in relief. They did not return to Sortiarius, not yet, but word spread. The Ninth Path now had two voices, not unified, but aligned. Ahriman continued his work, refining the restoration, drawing new memories from old warriors, unsealing minds once thought lost. Magnus watched, guided, spoke at last, not in riddles or fury, but in teaching. And in time, the Rubric Marines were no longer silent statues. They were legionnaires, warriors, poets, historians. Some remembered entire lives, others only fragments. But they remembered. The Thousand Suns had not returned. They had been reborn, not in flame, not in vengeance, but in voice. The galaxy would continue to burn, empires would rise and fall, but somewhere across 1,000 shattered stars, the dust of Prospero now spoke in crimson tones once more. And in the black between the stars, the Legion marched again. Not as ghosts, but as sons, sons of a dream, sons of a memory, sons of a city that refused to die, sons of Prospero,